for hanging with us as we allowed our members to get here. Really excited that we have the entire committee here with us tonight. Vadim is joining us by phone, and Britt and Steve are going to be joining us just a little bit later, but I thought it would be great if everybody could just go down the line, introduce yourself if you're sitting on a committee or a chair, if you could just state that committee as well.
Patrick Nolan, the chair or co-chair of the subcommittee for people with mental illness.
Elliot Young, I guess working on the subcommittee on race, ethnicity, and other.
Amy Anderson, and I haven't picked a subcommittee yet.
Lakian Drury, co-chair.
Vivi Marcia Perez, race, ethnic, and other subcommittee.
Lakeisha Dumas, co-chair, please.
Andrew Calick, member of the steering committee and the settlement agreement and policy committee.
Yolanda Salguero, co-chair of the youth subcommittee.
Sam Sachs, chair of the Race, Ethnicity, Others Committee.
So we have quite a packed agenda tonight, so just want to let everybody know we'll go probably right up to 8:30, if not a little bit after, so have patience with us tonight. I'm going to turn it over to co-chair Lakeisha to do our opening moment of silence.
Violence, who lost folks to mental illness, and who have family members who are struggling to get the services they need for mental illness. The box, if you have your name, and we'll have a moment of silence for them if you want to participate. Come up, and and those who are in our hearts, our minds. Just a moment of silence. All right, moving to subcommittee reports. Steering committee.
Steering committee, our last meeting we basically talked a lot about the recommendations that are coming up tonight. We spent a substantial time looking at the recommendation process, which is on here on the agenda under recommendations. but we're not going to go through tonight just in the interest of time, but just looking at how do we streamline the process. I feel very confident that we have a process that works for both the public to bring recommendations to pccep and also for pccep members to get those passed through and just kind of have more of an understanding of what the roles are in both of those. And that's something we've been working on for the last several months. So feel confident about that. So we ironed that out. And then just spent the rest of the bulk of the time talking about the COCO report that's going to be presented tonight and just looking at strategy around that and what are, where does pccep fit into that whole process between the city, the Department of Justice, and PPB. So that was that, and then setting the agenda for tonight and coming up with what was important out of all that. Oh, and then also debriefing the pccep retreat, which was a very helpful 2-day process where pccep members just got to kind of reflect on everything that we've been through in the last 6 months or so, new members and things of that nature, and just kind of realign ourselves and figure out what our plan is going forward. So it was a much needed time, and we're looking forward to doing more of those more frequently. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that, Andrew.
Nope, it's a lot.
All right, subcommittee, people with mental illness.
Hi. We had a great meeting. We discussed our 2 new recommendations that we are bringing forward tonight, and that pretty much covers.
Thank you. Race, ethnicity, and other subcommittee.
Hi, my name is Sam Sachs. Again, was it October 3rd? 4th. October 4th, we had a subcommittee meeting at Highland Christian Church where we invited the community to come together and hear from the gun violence reduction team. The gun violence reduction team did a presentation, a PowerPoint of who they were as the gang violence reduction team to who they are today, kind of going over to give information to community members because there's been some confusion. There's a lot that has changed, not just the name, but their role and the work that they do. So they did a PowerPoint presentation. I think everyone from Captain, Lieutenant, and Chief Deputy Shear was there. Everyone was there and available to answer questions. So it was very informative about what the work that they do. We then heard from 3 community members that were affected by gun violence and 1 officer from Portland Police who has worked on both the gang enforcement team and the gun violence reduction team since, I think maybe 15, 20 years. We talked about what he's experienced and relationships he's built. We then had group discussion and heard from community members that were able to express their concerns about the work that's being done and what they would like to see done moving forward. And it was felt it was very transparent and open. We did not discuss any of the data because they did not have the data at the time. They were still gathering it, preparing it, but they said that they would come back at a later date to bring the data and to have another discussion. I think there probably wasn't time to do both because data needs a lot of attention. But I thought it was a really informative meeting, and it was good for the community to be there. We need to get more community members there, more people that are affected by gun violence and at those meetings. And the gun violence reduction team said that they are open to having more of those types of sessions where community-driven community members can come and they can explain what the work they do, hear from community members. So I want to open it up to the other committee members if they want to add, because it was a pretty powerful, impactful meeting. Marcia or Lafayette, if you want to say anything.
Sure, yeah, we were able to come up with some recommendations out of the feedback, and we talked about those at our last meeting. But one of the things that I found was really important, I think that there was a lot of power in the room as far as dialogue goes. And one thing that I think is really important is that we evaluate the process. So I've solicited feedback from folks that attended as far as the location, appropriateness, time, certain things to be informed by the community as far as being trauma informed and sensitive to different walks of life and accessibility. I also am working with the gun violence reduction team to set up a time to debrief and hear about what their thoughts are and how we can come back. And I think that was a very preliminary, in the early stages of doing something really great in the long term. So I'm excited. I thought it was really great, and so far the feedback's been positive. So we are moving forward, and hopefully once they do have the data, we'll be facilitating another listening session, and would love to see a greater outcome from communities that are impacted by gun violence.
Yeah, that's.
No, that's it, I think, summarized. Thanks for the recommendations. Do you have those with you?
No, they're not completely drafted.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Okay, settlement and agreement policy committee.
Sure. So we had a couple of agenda items this month. The first was talking about how to move the Truth and Reconciliation Commission model forward. As some of you recall, we recommended that the Police Bureau incorporate a Truth and Reconciliation model into its community engagement plan. The Bureau did that, but also mentioned that a Truth and Reconciliation model cannot just include the Bureau, it has to include many other community stakeholders, which we agree with. And so one of the things that we were trying to do at this meeting was identify certain stakeholders who we could invite to a future subcommittee meeting and talk about what comes next. What do we need to know? Who needs to be at the table? And how do we make this something that's beyond just pen on paper and real? So that's one of our key goals. We also discussed a couple of additional policy issues that are sort of front and center in a variety of places, including Portland, one of which is facial recognition technology and the use of facial recognition technology by both public and private entities. There has been discussion of this at the City Council. Commissioner Hardesty has been particularly outspoken about the use of this technology, and so what we'd like to do again as a subcommittee is bring together some relevant stakeholders as well as anyone else in the community who wants to take part in a discussion of the pros and cons and issues that facial recognition technology brings up. So we will be again scheduling that for a later subcommittee meeting, and all of you as well as the general public will know when we calendar that item. And our last thing was talking about the compliance officer report that we'll hear about shortly. So a lot more to come on that. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, youth subcommittee.
Thank you, Lakeisha. Our committee met on the 13th from 3 to 5, so we had a good 2-hour meeting. Half of our committee was in there though, which kind of brought us to reaching out to our admin staff, asking if we had any youth applications. And so at this time, we're still accepting youth applications to try and increase our numbers for our board. We recapped the retreat for folks who attended. We reviewed the mental health committee recommendations that they're asking for us to vote on tonight. That took up a bulk of our meeting. And then our survey, which is supported by Portland Public Schools, we talked about that because we now have been asked to send over 6 additional documents, which we did not have. So we are going to work on those 6 additional documents, one of them which includes a copy of approval from an institutional review board. Thank you.
Thank you for all the subcommittee updates. I'm going to turn it back over to Lakiana.
Okay, so we're going to move into our Cocoa Town Hall. This is one of the parts of the settlement agreement where pccep is supposed to have a quarterly town hall with the compliance officer, Dr. Rosenbaum. So he will be presenting their quarterly report that has to do with compliance issues. So we'll invite him up. The presentation will be up here. If you would like a paper copy of the presentation, you can find it up at the front where the sign-in is at. pccep members can probably just turn around to face the presentation or look on from the paper copy if you have that. Followed by the presentation, we will open it up to pccep comments and questions, and then open it up for public comment. And this will last around an hour. Thank you. Dr. Rosenbaum?
Thank you. Is this mic on here?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right, I'm Dennis Rosenbaum, the compliance officer, and thank you all for being here and putting up with me talking here. I will try to run this PowerPoint slide as I'm talking as well. Let's see if it works. No, it doesn't. Where do I point this? Which direction? It's working. Oh, it is working. It's just slower. Okay. So basically, I'm going to cover this, kind of quickly go through it. There's quite a bit of findings. If we can hold the questions till I get done, then we'll have plenty of time, hopefully. There's two different areas our report contains. First of all, there's an overview of compliance with paragraphs in the settlement agreement that were approved and received substantial compliance in 2018, but were not revisited in 2019. So we cover force, community-based mental health services, crisis intervention, and employee information services in that category. We update those. And then I'll give you a quick status report on the paragraphs where the city or PPB had not achieved substantial compliance by the time of our last report, July 1st, and that's training, accountability, and community engagement. And then we'll finish off with those, and it's a good place to end with the community engagement. I'll refer to the Portland Police Bureau as PPB just to be short, and I'll move quickly through this. So let's go to the force slides here, 3 paragraphs. We found that the PPB has continued to enforce the 2 force directives, 1010 and 101010. These directives instruct officers and supervisors about their responsibilities for all use of force events. For instance, they cover the requirements pertaining to force reporting, supervisory responsibilities, and lethal force. Related to force reporting, we've reviewed their FDCR report, which is their force data collection report, very carefully. It does capture all the key elements that we feel are essential to get a candid, complete account of force. After a force event, supervisors on the whole are doing a good job of reviewing these force decision makings by officers. We've looked at the force reports ourselves, and they're interviewing witnesses, making decisions as to whether any directives were violated by the officer using force. And also our analysis shows that these after-action reports by supervisors are being completed 99% of the time within the 72 hours that they're required to be completed by. And they have to notify Professional Standards Division, PSD, in cases of serious use of force, force against persons with mental illness or suspected misconduct. And then PSD actually is required to include all the same material that is in the after-action report that supervisors would do. Our analysis shows that these processes are fairly complete and accurate. We've done a lot of sampling of different cases. Finally, paragraph 71, the PPB is required to maintain their supervisory levels, and we use span of control as a metric here, which we think is good. And currently it's 5 to 1, so 5 officers to 1 supervisor. We consider that acceptable, and they've maintained that throughout these 5 years. I should say, for those of you who are new to this, including maybe some of the pccep members, that this is 5 years we've been doing this in Portland, just so you know, and we've spent a lot of time, and I'll come back to that issue in a minute, because in terms of progress being made. Let me move on to force to custody. This gives you, we tracked the use of force levels over the past 3.5 years, and they've consistently maintained a force to custody ratio of about 3 to 4%, which means for every custody, arrest, detention, force is used about 3% of the time. So 97% of the time it's not being used. And this is pretty stable even after they've expanded the list of actions that are defined as force. In the last year, they've expanded that to include more minor incidents of force, such as resisted handcuffing. So the big picture, though, frankly, it's not listed here, but force is a rare event. For those of you who don't study this, it's about 1/4 of 1% of all the calls that come in. And in terms of mental health, which is the main focus of the settlement agreement, there were nearly, in 2018, where we have complete data, there were nearly 26,000 cases that an officer defined as someone perceived to have a mental health condition. Of those 26,000, 0.7% ended up with the use of force. So 99.3% of those officer contacts with people having a mental health condition did not result in force. I just want to put that all in perspective, because sometimes we lose track. Now, of the cases that did involve force with a person with mental illness, when force was used, it tended to be at the lowest level. There's 4 levels of force in the police bureau. Level 4 is, for example, 69% of those, of all the force incidents were level 4. And 49% were control against resistance, where a person is somehow resisting something and the officer has to control them, and resisted handcuffing. They refuse to put their hands in front or behind them, so they assist with that. But there's no hitting, no spraying, no tasering, no shooting, none of that. Just want to be clear that you understand what's going on with a lot of these cases. Community-based mental health services. Okay. Now, this is clearly a debated subject, and I look forward to hearing more about it tonight, about the adequacy of the coordinated mental health and addiction services in Portland and providing enough walk-in centers. But I do want to stress again from our perspective that the crux of paragraph 88 is that the primary responsibility for a comprehensive mental health system falls under the purview of the state and community-based mental health service providers. So we, in part of our job, and I'll say this throughout my presentation, we look at what the settlement agreement says. We're responsible for the legal terminology there. You could debate whether this should have been in there or how it should be handled, but we look at, did PPB and the city have they done what they can within their power? We said they've continued to act with their partners in the overall delivery of community-based mental health services. For example, the Behavioral Health Unit, BHU, does include state, county, and local representation, mental health service providers, and persons with lived experience. And again, paragraphs 89 and 90, the requirement of the settlement agreement places the expectation on the community care organizations, not on the Portland Police Bureau. So our hands are kind of tied in terms of who's responsible for this stuff. And these include creating a drop-off center and establishment of the committees. Where possible, I think PPB has assisted in bringing these requirements to fruition, including participating in the Transportation Subcommittee and the prior CCO subcommittees. Now, we acknowledge that this community concern about the Unity Center and CCO subcommittees, but again, it's an issue of whose job it is to deal with that, and I look forward to that discussion. We believe that in this case, they've made a reasonably good attempt to partner with folks and to serve on these subcommittees. So we can come back to that. The next one, let's see here. No, I guess I can't. There we go. Crisis intervention. A number of paragraphs here, again, critical to the settlement agreement. The Behavioral Health Unit, BHU, and the specific teams within BHU continue to comply with the requirements of the settlement agreement. For example, BHU's leadership structure conforms to paragraph 91 with the high-ranking lieutenant overseeing those committees, those teams, the Enhanced Crisis Intervention Team, ECIT, BERT, the Behavioral Health Response Team, and Service Coordination Team, SCT. The Behavioral Health Unit, BHU, collects, utilizes, and shares data and information in a manner that conforms to the settlement agreement. There's a number of paragraphs that do that. They have an analyst there that's doing some serious work. For instance, they continue to utilize the mental health template. That's a form the officers fill out when they think someone, there's a mental health crisis or situation, whenever an officer interacts with someone. Now, PPB uses the template to identify those who come into regular contact with PPB. That's 3 templates within a 30-day period, and make referral to the Behavioral Health Response Team, or BERT. And they have implemented a regular audit function of the mental health interaction data. For instance, they recently identified a slight increase in police contacts among BERT service recipients 60 days after service. And although this is still below the level of interaction that occurred before BERT started, which is some evidence that the BERT program, we've reported that previously, is helping. But the BERT team is now follows up with their clients prior to the 60-day time period. So there's more intervention there. As part of the Behavioral Health Coordination Team, PPB and other entities within the mental health service delivery system continue to share non-confidential information when an individual has repeat contacts with PPB or represents an escalating concern. PPB has maintained its relationship with Multnomah County Crisis Line by sharing BERT referrals with them. The BHU Advisory Committee also continues to meet regularly and provide recommendations to PPB. The Advisory Committee members include representatives of all areas of mental health response. There we go. All right. More on mental health crisis. The crisis intervention remains a core competency of PPB officers, with all officers receiving a minimum of 40 hours of pre-service training and annual in-service training. Additionally, the Enhanced Crisis Intervention Team officers continue to receive an additional 40 hours of training prior to becoming an ECIT officer. I do want to stress, for those of you in a national perspective, that's way above what other departments do. Behavioral health response team officers are also required to attend the ECIT training. Let's see, the service coordination team continues to serve those with high rates of criminality and addiction. Finally, in April of 2019, BOEC at the Bureau of Emergency Communication, or your 911 center here, conducted an in-service training that reinforced the notion of when in doubt, send them out, which is means send out the ECIT officers. We've been arguing all along that these officers are specially trained and have special skills to handle these situations. And we would like to see them sent out more, and in fact that has happened. So they did an in-service training on the dispatchers and the call takers, and after receiving that training we noticed an increase in the number of ECIT calls compared to a year earlier, as well as an increase in the proportion of mental health calls that were dispatched as ECIT calls. So in sum, we maintain that PPB has substantially complied with the paragraphs within the crisis intervention section of the settlement agreement. Please remember that this was the primary focus of the settlement agreement, and in many ways, we would maintain at this point in time, after 5 years, that Portland actually is a model for other cities. The PPB mental health model, not necessarily the whole citywide model. Because that's a whole nother issue. All right, let's move on to employee information. Employee information systems essentially look at any potentially problematic trends in an officer's use of force, and if that officer exceeds a certain threshold, such as 3 or more complaints in a 6-month period, a threshold that would trigger a case review for that officer. It took a few years to get this requirement in place. That we pushed pretty hard for this, but now PPB has maintained its EIS thresholds and added some. There's 8 events now that can trigger a review. Our analysis is they've been managing those reviews pretty well. They send a lot of alerts on to supervisors, which can be overwhelming at times, but they've figured out a system to do that. PPB also continues to utilize a risk management approach to identifying potentially problematic officers. By this I mean they're throwing lots of variables into an equation and looking at what factors predict various outcomes. For those of you who remember your statistics class, like a normal distribution, most people are in the middle, and out at the tails are the people that, 95% of us fall within 1 standard deviation, and 99% of us fall within 2 standard deviations of the mean. But if you get, 3 standard deviations. But if you get out, so here they're looking at who are the officers who are 3 standard deviations from the mean. All right, they're in the 1% that are that far from the mean, and those that are 5%. And what do we know about them, and what factors predict their behavior? So this is the kind of thing that I was hoping they would do, and they're now doing. And finally, I'll just say that PPB, again, conditions of settlement agreement employs EIS administrators. They have 2 now, and they've created an EIS manual that memorializes all this for future training of administrators. So nothing's lost when people move around. Now I'm going to quickly update you on sections in the settlement agreement that were not in substantial compliance last time we wrote our report, which was the end of June, on the second quarterly report. So we had to update those and focus on those paragraphs in the settlement agreement that were not in substantial compliance. Officer accountability, paragraph 121. In the past we've noted that both PPB's Internal Affairs Division as well as the City Auditor's Independent Police Review, IPR, have struggled to complete the administrative investigations of officer misconduct or complaints of misconduct within the 180-day timeline from the settlement agreement. And this has presented a big challenge for both groups. And however, I do want to say that both groups have worked very hard in the last year, held many meetings. We've attended a lot of those. We've been all involved in this. They've introduced significant managerial and procedural changes in the way they do these investigations, such as case management strategies. They now hold weekly meetings. They share mailboxes to increase efficiency. They review these overdue cases. Why is this case running so long in the investigation? Let's see what the issues are. They work in coordination with BHR, which is sometimes involved, human resources, as needed, and they provide advanced copies of materials to unit managers, that was slowing up the process. There are other things as well. I just list a few. And these changes were then memorialized in new standard operating procedures, or SOPs, that could be read by current and new employees down the road to help standardize a more efficient investigatory process. And you can see the difference. As it turns out, compliance with the 180-day timeline for completing administrative investigations of misconduct has gone from only 50% were completed on time in 2018 to 94% in the first quarter of 2019. So that's a pretty impressive increase. Also, the stages, I do have a map here. There's different stages of the investigative process, and we summarize these stages and analyze them. And you can see that over the last year, from that the percentage of cases that were overdue at each stage has gone from almost 40% down to single digits, 7 or 8%. So again, more evidence that they are cleaning up the process, making it more efficient, and getting the investigations done in a more timely manner, because that's also fair to the complainant as well as the officer involved. Training. That should say paragraph 84. I don't know why it says 81. I apologize for that. PPB's only remaining requirement for substantial compliance here was paragraph 84, which requires them to increase their use of role-playing scenarios and interactive exercises. From the very start, I've been pushing PPB to follow best practices and evidence-based policing to utilize what is a procedural justice framework in training, which would really help prevent escalation of tensions and reduce the need to use force to gain compliance by community members. Procedural justice in a nutshell there, I list the 4 basic principles. Voice means the officers should give the community member a voice and let them talk and explain their situation and not make just commands and orders. They should respect them, show respect and dignity for everyone in the community. Neutrality means make decisions that are unbiased, not based on gender, race, sexual orientation, anything like that. And demonstrate trustworthy motives, that the community member can trust them because they're showing concern for their welfare or their situation, which can occur through empathy or compassion or various other things, suggestions and help, tips like that. For years I've argued that lecturing, however, in the classroom about these principles is not enough. Officers need to practice the skills implied by these principles, just as they practice firing their weapons and other things. Practice self-defense. They need to practice these social skills. PPB now has done that successfully. As part of the fall in service recently, they introduced this training scenario that was pretty sophisticated and allow officers to practice their procedural justice and communication skills and receive individualized feedback during a debriefing session. And that's really important, individualized feedback. We observed this training and have concluded that it satisfies the requirement of paragraph 84. Now, going beyond the requirements of the settlement agreement, under the new chief, they've institutionalized procedural justice as a core component of their training program rather than a standalone piece. So, in other words, it's integrated into nearly all of their classes at the training academy, which I give them credit for. And the impact is starting to show up in the citywide surveys. Satisfaction with police contacts went up pretty dramatically from 2016 to 2019, for example, overall, with most people, not with everybody. Okay. Community engagement. You've been waiting for this all night. Okay. And the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing, PCEP. Paragraph 142. We've monitored the formation and functioning of PCEP since mid-2018. And since your first meeting in November of 2018, which is almost a year now, PCEP has met regularly and provided multiple opportunities for community input on police-community relations. At this point, we've narrowed our compliance focus to key elements of paragraph 142, although PCEP did not have to substantially comply on there's a massive list in 142 to achieve substantial compliance, even though you're free to do that. Here are the key tasks that I listed on the slide there and the outcomes. So PCEP has held regular meetings, subcommittee meetings, and town hall meetings with community input, such as this one. PCEP has a working relationship now with PPB, providing input on PPB's annual report, metrics, and community engagement plan. From our perspective, from my perspective, PCEP has the bylaws, the group values, the diverse membership, the leadership, and the city's support needed to function as a legitimate body. Based on our observations, PCEP also has the critical self-assessment skills needed for survival and adaptation to its environment. For example, the group has prepared a report on the challenges they face, so that they're not just naively moving ahead here. They know what some of the issues are, and I know they've discussed them as well in the meetings, and are not afraid to be honest and take a critical look at the obstacles they face. In addition to these activities, PCEP has streamlined the recommendation process to make it more accessible and transparent. Based on all of this activity and more, the group's resilience in the face of inevitable challenges such as turnover and meeting attendance, we have come to the conclusion that PCEP is functioning as a legitimate body for community engagement, and we can have assigned them substantial compliance with paragraph 142. Okay, one more. This one is about the city and the police bureau side of the community engagement component, paragraphs 145, 146, 150. Based on progress in the second corner, those are the ones remaining. And here's our assessment. On 145, PPB has developed a working, transparent relationship with PCEP and has developed a reasonable community engagement plan with input from PCEP. And they have taken PCEP's recommendations seriously. We should note that the community engagement plan was adopted by the Portland City Council on October 2nd, 2019. Paragraph 146, PCEP presented the community survey results. PPB presented the community survey results at PCEP's July 23rd meeting to inform the work of PCEP, and they also used the results to inform the development and implementation of the community engagement plan. For example, they noted that the community expressed concern about excessive force against persons experiencing a mental health crisis or communities of color. In response, they have beefed up their plan. Their community engagement plan gives increased attention to implicit bias training and procedural justice. They're also currently working on training modules for cultural competency for all officers and are creating a pool of community members to help with training. I think that's important to actually get community members involved in training. I know Lakian has done some of that, and some other folks have too. They're planning additional councils for community involvement, and they're exploring PCEP's recommendation on truth and reconciliation. But the community engagement plan of PPB is a plan. The chief wants to continue this dialogue with PCEP and others to refine that thinking. Paragraph 150, PPB has released its annual report in a timelier fashion than it did the year before, as we had recommended and PCEP had recommended. and presented it in each precinct area and at the city council meeting. In summary, because of this work, PPB has substantially complied with paragraphs 145, 146, and 150 of the settlement agreement. All right, now, as I bring closure to this, I want to ask, what does substantial compliance mean, since that's kind of a debated subject here. Most simply, it means the city and PPB have complied with the legal terms of the settlement agreement. But if anyone thinks we're just checking boxes here, I spent the first 2 years fighting about that issue. I'm not a box checker. I am a person who believes in documenting the quality of implementation. We spent many hours focusing on that, and we held the city's feet to the fire to ensure high quality implementation of changes. And that was painful in the first couple of years, but we finally got through that. Also, substantial compliance, however, does not mean that PPB is flawless or that there's no room for improvement in many areas. I'm sure there is. This is not an end, it's a beginning of a process. Thanks to the settlement agreement, I believe the Police Bureau is much further down the road of organizational improvement and functioning more as a what I call learning organization. I've said this before. Learning organizations are ones that have systems in place where they're constantly collecting data about themselves internally and their external environment. And they're auditing themselves and they're evaluating their programs, and they have feedback loops built in so that they can adapt and adjust easily and quickly to their environment. And PPB has, over 5 years that we've been monitoring this, is much, much better at that now. And so they have the feedback loops built in. They evaluate. They have EIS to look for which officers are way outside the mean. They have evaluations of their training programs. They audit all their force reports. I could go on. So there's a lot going on like that. There's a bunch of audits set up. But anyway, let me just finish here. What are the next steps? The Department of Justice, DOJ, will submit their report later this year, soon, sometime, the next month or so. I can't say. I don't know. But DOJ, it's important for me to note to you, they're the final authority on whether the city has achieved substantial compliance with the settlement agreement, not the COCO. We're independent. This is a strange arrangement in Portland, unlike some other cities. But we are independent of them. They're independent. You guys are independent of them. But they have the final say about what is substantial compliance. They do listen to us, and we collect a lot of data and look at a lot and assess a lot of factors. Now, once achieved, the city is required to stay in substantial compliance for at least 1 year. So this isn't over for those of you who think we're walking away from this. We will evaluate compliance during what was called the maintenance year and report whether the established remedies are in fact durable. They have to have durable remedies and remain in place at the same level of commitment in 2020 that they were in 2019. Again, we're not checking boxes. We'll do an in-depth analysis. We'll report any discrepancies or deviations to the Justice Department and Judge Simon. Paragraph 178A says that substantial compliance means that the violations must be, quote, minor or occasional, not systematic. So we will have to keep an eye on that. I can just a footnote if you guys want to read any of Sam Walker's work, a colleague of mine. He's looked at reforms in many different cities. These things are beneficial. I'm making the argument that PPB is a better organization than it was 5 years ago. But they can also fall back. Some cities fall back. So you do have to keep an eye on it. My point, our job is limited and defined by the courts. I don't think the job of pccep is. And I want to close by just making a couple comments on the resolution to defer substantial compliance and I didn't know about this until today, so my comments may not seem as informed as they could be. But I do, first of all, on a positive note, I do like the instinct of the pccep to hold PPB accountable to a high standard and to have high standards as to what would be excellent policing. I guess, though, my first impression is that pushing back on compliance when we've already done this 5 years of work is not really the best way to go. I think that, and I would say that we have been in agreement with DOJ and they've been in agreement with us on most things. I know Dan out here in the audience will say we disagreed on some things. He keeps records of this. But generally, I would be surprised if DOJ reaches a lot of different conclusions when they do the official statement here in another month or two. So we're not that far apart. So I think my feeling would be you can do that, and I encourage you to do whatever you need to do, believe me. But I think it might be better to look forward and ask the question, what can you achieve? How can you achieve the outcomes of greatest interest to the PCEP? And you don't, I'm not saying you have to live within the confines of the settlement agreement. You don't. You were appointed by the mayor to do whatever you think is important. The settlement agreement is one of your tasks. Chief Outlaw has made it clear that she's has an open door on this draft community engagement plan. What dialogue do you want to have with her on that, and what are the various ways community engagement can go? What does that look like? So, and I guess my last thought would be, at some point we have to pass the baton to you guys and to the city, the communities, so I would encourage you to look to yourselves and the community and not COCA or DOJ, that it's time for a community voice to take the lead and not outsiders. So, thank you. Oh, I should just say the last slide. If anyone has feedback on our report that they don't get to say tonight, or feel free to email it to us at that email address by November 4th. Thank you. Because it's a draft at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenbaum, for that thorough presentation. We've got two sections in this now. We're going to have PCEP feedback, and then we're going to open it up to community feedback. What I'd like to do is start on either one end or the other, and we'll just go down the row and give everybody roughly 2 minutes to make any comments or feedback on this streamlining process. So I don't know if Patrick, you want to start? Patrick, you want to start with that? Yeah, I'm going to actually start with Yolanda, just because Steve and Britt are just jumping in here. And if you would like your turn to come after, you can just say pass for the time being.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on the aspect of comparing PBB to other agencies or on a national level. I appreciate that distinction, so that way we're knowing that we are doing a better job than other folks.
Andrew?
Thank you, Doctor. One question on what you've written here for paragraph 100. You mentioned that when there are calls that meet the ECIT criteria, an ECIT officer responds about 3/4 of the time. But that the lack of response in that quarter is rarely due to an ECIT officer not being available. In fact, it's only 6% of the scenarios where an ECIT officer doesn't respond. What accounts for the other 94% of the circumstances? Do you have a sense of that?
Well, actually, Tom, are you still on the phone? No, he wasn't. Tom knows more about that than I do. I think that they were not dispatched they were not sent out by their supervisor. Tom, do you want, or we may also ask this, I'm not sure, do you want to comment on that? I'll put you on the spot. What happened to this? Oh, it has to do with the ECIT calls that were not dispatched. There's about, 25%?
Right.
Where they were not sent out. And there are people here from the police bureau that may be able to respond to. Do you remember what your analysis of that?
The short answer is if there is no ECIT officer.
Hold on one second. Hold on. What do we have?
Put it near the mic.
Oh, hold it near the mic, yeah.
Okay, if there was no ECIT officer available, then no ECIT officer would be dispatched. But I think the situations that you're also referring The incident was resolved prior to an ECIT officer being able to get on scene. Higher priority calls where the sergeant called off the ECIT officer. So it's not that 25% that there's no ECIT officer available. In fact, I think it was only 6% when there was just no ECIT officer available.
I think this is a question, Maxine's here somewhere in the audience. She asked, she covered this in her story.
Yeah, I think there were times when I had asked the same question, and you had said there are times when the call is completed before the ECIT officer gets out. It was called an incomplete call.
Yeah, some of those calls were, we're not sure exactly all of them. I don't think we have a complete answer to that question, but we can look into that more. Does anyone from the police bureau want to respond? Oh yeah, we've got a deputy chief here. Respond. Do you have a microphone?
Tracy Reed, Portland City Attorney. The majority of the 94% of the 25%, I don't know the exact numbers right now. I do know that the majority of those calls, an ECIT officer is in fact dispatched by BOBC, but often, remember that all of our officers are CIT trained. Often an ECIT officer will be dispatched, but the CIT trained officer that gets there first is able to handle the call and the ECIT officer is canceled. That's a high percentage.
That makes sense.
Thank you.
A lot of the regular officers feel they can handle these calls. And so, and they do handle the vast majority of the mental health calls. So ECIT is called in a smaller percent. And they're handling the ones where someone's life is in danger, somebody's threatening somebody. It's the more serious ones for the ECIT. And like I said, there's a lot of mental health calls that aren't, 26,000 a year. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy. Lakeisha?
Okay. Marcia?
I appreciate with the implementation of the training that there's role playing. It wasn't clear to me if the entire bureau got that training, if everybody's cycled through that, or if it was just specific units such as behavioral health units. So if you could clarify.
Yeah, sure. So everybody did get that. There was required in-service training for all officers.
And I think to the point of being a national leader and what we do, I think Portland, Multnomah County is a national leader in best practices, but I would extend that we can't, that's not sufficient for compliance, in my opinion, as far as, I think we have the resources to do, we are a model agency here in Portland, so I think it's really important to live up to that standard and continue to do as best as we can through integrated procedural justice. And I wonder, through the employee, I wrote it down somewhere, info system, how are we measuring the use of procedural justice or implicit bias training effectiveness on officers who are not doing gross overt use of force issues in the community. So how are we doing that on a day-to-day before it escalates?
So for the average officer, I mean, there's always potential citizen complaints, right? So they have that availability and they look at that. And the reverse is also receiving commendations, compliments from people. That's kept in their files as well. This system now, they're required to record a lot more information than they used to. But I think that my preferred strategy, and one that I've recommended for years, and I'm very pleased that Portland is starting this, and that is the contact survey. So that community survey that you are all familiar with, there was a component of it where it asked, have you had any contact with a police officer in the last year? And if they did, they ask about these kinds of procedural justice things. Was the officer respectful? Did the officer listen to you? That sort of thing. And but that's a small group. We have to remember, and when we get into this later about the community-wide survey, 2 out of 3 people in Portland, and in a lot of cities it's 3 out of 4, don't have a contact with the police in the last year or 2. And so they're just listening to media, whatever. But the ones that actually have contact, you want to listen to them. And it turns out that the Portland Police Bureau is just starting working with the National Police Foundation in Washington, D.C., is field testing a new contact survey now, using both, I believe, text messaging and telephone interviews, but trying to get at, there's your base, for those of you in the audience that aren't familiar with what I'm talking about, it's basically customer satisfaction surveys in the public sector. It's how were you treated by an officer that you had contact with in the last couple of weeks? And that's a database that I happen to sit on the National Council on Measures for Justice, developing new metrics for criminal justice nationwide, and we're pushing for things like this. We need new metrics. We can't just rely on the existing things. So Portland is hopefully on the cutting edge there. So I would keep track of that data when it comes in.
Well, I think I'm aware of the survey that's being distributed, but I think there's been negative feedback, especially of communities of color, where officers have gone and distributed or attempted to have folks fill out the survey, and really the officers are not representative of the community that they're. So there are practical barriers and some things that I think the community should be working towards, or this pccep can be working towards to help facilitate the delivery of the survey.
Yeah, no, I agree. But I think the survey you're talking about is a different survey. That's something that PPB is probably doing as part of its community engagement work. This survey is being done independent, out by an outside third party. And it would just involve text messages or telephone calls. Wouldn't involve any physical surveys.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to just speak to pccep's role in all of this, with the compliance office, with the city, and with the community as a whole. Kind of responding to the end of your comments about just what is pccep's role in this, and looking at the settlement agreement, but also going beyond that. And I think that pccep can do both at the same time. When this settlement agreement comes by us and we're looking at these reports, we have a duty to represent the community, which is not always here, but we interact with as pccep members in officially in this capacity, but also in our other roles. Most of us are working in environments where we're coming in contact with the city and its community members. And I think it's essential when something like this is presented to us that we, as you had mentioned, hold people's feet to the fire. And I think that there, in my opinion, is a large concern about there being substantial compliance in regards to everything. And what I want to point out is the difference between outcomes and outputs. And the settlement agreement addresses a lot of outputs, a lot of things that they want to see, the trainings, the mental health units, the teams and those things. But those aren't the end goals. Those are just what we want to get to in order to get to some outcomes, as you were mentioning, around procedural justice, people being treated fairly, people not being killed, folks with mental illness being properly serviced. And until we know what those outcomes are that we want, how are we able, as Marcia and others have pointed out, able to really even assess whether these things are being done? There's a training that the PBB has done, but is that actually leading to officers using less force or helping community members, or feeling that they're feeling better treated? And the community members that I've talked to, that's not the case. With youth communities, with communities of color, that's not what I've been hearing. This executive summary mentions if any violations of the agreement are minor or occasional and are not systemic. We have the death of Andre Gladden and Lane Martin today, or this year, 2 of the 5 people killed by police this year. That's 40%, and both of them were having mental health crises at the times of their death. So how, in a year where 40% of the people killed by police are having mental health crises, can we still be achieving substantial compliance for a settlement agreement that specifically deals with mental illness? And so the question is, are Andre Gladden and Lane Martin, are those just outliers and just outside of what otherwise is good conduct, or are they part of systemic problems that still need to be addressed? I 100% agree that PPB has made tremendous strides in the 5 years that you guys have been working with them, but there's still a lot of progress to be made. It says the settlement agreement was designed to reassure the public and the court that changes made in Portland will be sustained. Changes have been made, but I don't know much of the public that feels reassured at this point, and so I believe that, and we'll get into this later, but that substantial compliance is still a ways off.
Okay, can I respond to that?
Yeah.
Okay, you made a lot of good points there, outcomes versus outputs. And I understand your frustration. There have been important incidents. I think, but I'm encouraging all of you to read the settlement agreement carefully and read our reports carefully and DOJ's reports. We are constrained by the settlement agreement. We are. You're not necessarily. But as far as we are focusing largely on changes in their process, changes in their program, changes in their behavior, changes in their training, changes in their audits. There isn't a lot of talk of outcomes. There's talk vaguely about trust. And they weren't held to certain outcomes. Although we have used outcomes periodically. We pushed for a community survey, which they've done every other couple of years, and these contact surveys now. And, and so I think that's one important, the changes themselves, the systems are in place to make change. And I do want to make another comment, which is that these changes don't they don't change a whole culture and a whole organization overnight. These things take years and decades, but they have to be sustained, and someone has to keep an eye on them. And regarding these you talked about, we don't know what the outcomes are, but there's been these horrible incidents, and they're traumatic incidents, and they're catastrophic for families and the community. And I'm not going to comment on some of those because they're still under investigation, but I want to put my academic hat on here for just a second. Okay, so, I spent 30 years training PhD students in how to evaluate social programs. How would you know if a program's working or not? And we don't, first of all, you need good research measures, but more importantly, you don't rely on, incidents are what we call error variance. I mean, there's tragic lives, but in a statistician's mind, it's error variance. It's random fluctuation. The reality is you have to look for patterns. You have to look for patterns overall. That's why DOJ calls them pattern and practice of excessive force. We can debate sometimes whether it's really a pattern or not, but that's what I encourage you to look for. There are going to be these things. That also means on that normal distribution, there's going to be a few cops that still don't get it after all this training. And what are we doing about that? So it's, both are important. And you can learn things, though, from events. Don't get me wrong. DOJ, there's been a bunch of publications in the last 5 years about sentinel events. What can we learn about a tragedy if we analyze it in detail? What went wrong where? What went wrong with the Boeing MAX 740? If we analyze in detail, we can figure out what went wrong in this particular force. Things could have been done better. And fortunately, what I'm telling you is that PPB now has systems in place where those inspectors analyze the heck out of those force cases and give feedback, in addition to legal prosecutorial issues. They give feedback immediately to, are there training implications for this? Are there implications for the individual, to his supervisor, that he doesn't do that again, whatever he did, So those systems were not in place a few years ago. I mean, they were informal sometimes, but now it's required. So there are things, but you don't change, you don't turn an ocean liner around overnight or immediately like a speedboat, right? I mean, it takes time. So, but I don't get me wrong, you guys should go wherever you need to go. I'm just saying the settlement agreement, and I don't know if DOJ is here and wants to refer to that, it's narrowly defined. You talk about kids in school. Someone in one of the recommendations I noticed being arrested too much, African Americans being arrested. That's not in here. But I'm not saying it's not important. I've seen that problem nationwide in other schools.
Yeah, and
so
I would.
That's fine. Tom wants to say something? Okay, Tom? That's not Tom, that's you. You want to say something? Okay, go ahead, Tom.
I just wanted to add to this conversation about systems being the outcome of implementation. So in the amended settlement agreement, paragraph 170 talks about how the COCO has to look at whether the implementation of the settlement agreement has created these various systems. There's systems for responding to persons of mental health crisis and accountability. And so what we've done with our quarterly and semi-annual reports is we've looked at not only has the implementation of the letter of the individual paragraphs been accomplished, but has it led to those systems? And so to kind of add on to what Dr. Rosenbaum was saying, with mental health, there's these systems of evaluating the mental health template data. One of the things that the analysts in the BHU did is he identified with BHRT clients, as they were nearing the 60-day period after receiving BHRT services, they saw a slight blip in police contact. So what they did is they got ahead of that.
Yeah, we
They
talked about
identified
that.
trend.
Yeah.
Right, and so basically has the implementation of the paragraphs led to systems, and that's a large part of where we're also finding substantial compliance, is that not only have they checked the box with the individual paragraphs, but they've also created these systems that act as a system for self-governance and as a system for self-improvement.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. And I guess the other one thing I'll say, and I'll stop talking, is if you guys really want to tell us that you feel that the city and PPD are not in substantial compliance to us, I would strongly encourage you to not necessarily talk about incidents or people or whatever, but say paragraph so-and-so, they did not do that. You know, what specific paragraph and what in that language didn't they do? Because that's what we're judging them by. It's not checking boxes, but it's legally binding for us.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Amy.
Yeah, speaking of paragraphs, there's two that really catch my attention, and one is paragraph 89 and one is paragraph 90. Both speak to the CCOs putting together one or more drop-off centers for first responders and public walk-in centers for individuals with addictions and or behavioral health services, which I totally understand. A lot of this wasn't mandated by, the settlement agreement, but I do notice that there's lots of references in both 89 and 90, which clearly kind of tell me that you're stating there was no opportunity for people to engage, but yet we find everything is substantially compliant. The other is down below in paragraph 90. It talks about these committees will pursue immediate and long-term improvements to the behavioral health care system. Initial improvements include, I guess in the COCO summary, increased sharing of information subject to lawful disclosure, but it doesn't say what information. Creation of rapid access clinics. I'd sure like to know where they are. Enhanced access to primary care providers. That's kind of exclusive to who their CCO is and who they're allowed to have as a provider. It makes it complicated to get new ones. Expand options for VOC operators to divert calls to civilian mental health services, but it doesn't explain who or what. Addressing unmet needs identified by Safer PDX. Who's Safer PDX and what do they do? Expanding and strengthening networks of peer-mediated services. Who's providing the peer-mediated services, and I guess how is it put out? So, and then it says down below that the officers did not have an ample opportunity to participate in subcommittee efforts, but it doesn't specify what subcommittees they did not have, I guess, access to getting into. Because it talks about having subcommittees formed to talk about this, and the BHU would be overseeing a lot of that information, but it doesn't get into descriptives as to who or what was done in order to show that it was substantial compliance for these two paragraphs. So that was just kind of my question is the who, the what, the where, and then you say that even though this can't be done, we've met substantial compliance. So I guess I'm a little confused.
Okay, well, Tom, you didn't hear that, right?
No, I heard that.
Okay, this is your area, but I will just say,
Can you put the phone up to my?
yeah, I will, but first I just want to say that, again, these are real problems. I don't deny that they are, and I don't think Tom will either, some of these. We can probably be more specific, but it's an issue of, in the end, who's responsible for this? And so, who's responsible for making these changes? But Tom, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, and I think I understand your concern with everything not being detailed out in this. I think that this is a function of this having been found in substantial compliance in a prior report, and this was just the updated on that prior substantial compliance. So our summary of paragraph 90, you're right that it doesn't give the detail. So I'm looking at the full amended settlement agreement, and so the increased sharing of information, that part, that's between BOEC, Multnomah County, and healthcare providers. A lot of that is done with the BHCP. Again, and the crux of paragraph 90 is that the CCOs will immediately create these subcommittees. And so again, we look to see what PPD and the city can reasonably be expected to do in order to satisfy the intent of these paragraphs. So through PPD and through the BHU and the BHU coordinating team, there is increased sharing of information that's subject to lawful disclosure. The one part that you talked about where it was connecting and BOEC having the opportunity to connect to peer provider to civilian providers, BOEC partners with the Multnomah County Crisis Line when the call doesn't require a police response immediately, and the MCCCL they work with one of the CCOs. I forget it off the top of my head right now, but there is that coordination. Some of these, you're right, they haven't come to fruition. The paragraph 90G, the telepsychiatry, where you can do video conferencing, that's something that has not come out of the settlement agreement. But again, the question is, are the CCOs supposed to do it, which is what paragraph 90 says, and the CCOs aren't under the settlement agreement? So we look at what PPD has done, what the city has done, what BOEC has done, and that's where, maybe not in this report, and that's why I'm saying I apologize that most of this detailed information that I think you're asking for would have come when we had first found them in substantial compliance for paragraph 90. But the city and the city's entities have done a lot of things to at least try to accommodate the intent of paragraph 90. And that's where we find substantial compliance is in their efforts to do what they can within their power.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you for the presentation. So I heard you say two things. One, the theory is that all of this training will produce better results. And then you also said that over the 5 years you've seen those better results. So as an academic as well, I like to look at the data, and I appreciate you saying 2 incidents is hard to make a general conclusion from, but the Portland Police Bureau has collected data on use of force incidents, and their data for the last 2 years suggests that 50% of the use of force incidents are against houseless people, 27% are black people in a city that is 6% black, about 14% are people in a mental health crisis. So I would put the question to you, does that suggest, if all of this training has happened, that these are successful statistics as a result of that training. These statistics seem egregious and suggest that either the training is not working and or the settlement agreement will provide nothing in terms of outcome change. And I appreciate you saying you're beholden to what the actual paragraphs of the legal document say. But say, for instance, there were 1,000 people with mental illness killed by the police every year, or that 98% of the use of force incidents were houseless people. I think those outcomes have to mean something in terms of the output, in terms of the trainings, suggesting that these trainings aren't actually being effective. And a second question I have to you, in the 2018 auditor's report on the Gang Enforcement Task Force, they noted that in 90% of the traffic stops, there was no data collected on the reasons for those stops. And they criticized the Bureau for that. The Bureau acknowledged that. Is that data being collected? And if so, is it publicly available, or can pccep be given that data?
Okay. On the last question, by the way, I would suggest you, the auditor has done the latest analysis of that. I think the data are available, and I think they are doing a better job, but I can't speak for that because I haven't specifically investigated that. But back to your original, the theory is not just that training will lead to better results. It's actually, the DOJ model is more of a policy change leads to training, leads to better results. So, in fact, a big part of the settlement agreement is that they have to change their policies in all these areas. And we spent like a couple of years arguing about the wording of policy. And then that was the basis for training. But then the other thing that I just want to clarify the theory. My primary theory here, and Tom's, is that it's not the training, it's the measurement of the organization as a learning organization. So if you don't measure something, it doesn't matter. Nobody can care. You can lie about how good you're doing, etc. You don't keep measure. So I agree with you, the data. But so setting up all these internal systems of review and auditing and checking on themselves, as well as an external system of checking as the public who had a recent contact satisfied with the encounter. And I think that will tell you guys a lot if they keep doing that over the next few years. That's really critical. Regarding use of force, I mean, the glass half full, half empty. I mean, it's a very, the houseless thing. Here's another example. I think it's a tragedy in this country what's going on with homeless and houseless people. It's like, but two quick comments. One is we got to think bigger than the police. Okay. But secondly, with regard to police, show me in this consent decree, the settlement agreement, where that word is even mentioned. It's not. It's not in here. So I'm not saying you shouldn't take it up. I think you should. So I'm just saying different roles here is all I'm saying.
Okay, could I just ask you then, given this data, do you think the training is, there was the point about training about neutrality in this procedural justice. Neutrality means not targeting particular groups. Do you think that this data suggests that the police are not targeting particular groups?
Well, the houseless data is particularly complicated, I've learned. And someone from the police here may want to talk about that. A lot of those use of forces are, there's arrests over warrants and all kinds of things that make it unusual. But is that, that's an issue. In terms of bias, which is what you're talking about, excuse me, I should talk in the microphone. In terms of bias, this is a bigger issue than for tonight. We can't, researchers generally talk about disparities, okay, first, because it's hard to determine. Bias involves motive and knowing exactly what, but there are disparities. And so differences by race and by gender, by age, by all kinds of things. Young black males and young Hispanic males are stopped and used force a lot more than, not just everywhere in the country. But you need the right baseline. So you need the right denominator to determine, and we talked about this in one of our reports. I kind of gave the city credit for, in the Bureau for looking at, for example, traffic stops, looking at what the rate of traffic accidents were in that neighborhood as a good benchmark and denominator. So we don't have this figured out yet nationally. There's a lot of people talking about what's the appropriate benchmarks to determine whether there's really race bias. And I encourage you guys to look into that. I'd be happy to give you some references. But, so I'm uncomfortable answering that right away. I did say in my report that looks like, when you adjust for some of these things, the problem isn't as bad as I thought it was. I did not want to get into evaluate the gang unit. That was a whole nother issue, and the auditor has taken that on. So, but anyway, yeah, you're raising some good points here, and but I think that my last comment to you would be, again, the outcomes were not a main focus of the settlement agreement. The process was, but we did look at some outcomes. But it's also when you say, it doesn't seem to be having any effect at all. It's almost too soon, I would argue.
I would agree, it's too soon.
Yeah, too soon to expect the outcomes which aren't in the settlement agreement.
And too soon to say it's substantially compliant because of that.
Right.
Anyway.
Okay. Tom wants to say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Tom.
Sure. What I wanted to do is also, in the conversation about the houseless population, I also wanted to bring that back into the fold of systems and PCC's ability to identify trends and implement an improvement process. So one of the things that they did that we reported on this report is that they now have 5 BHRT teams. One of those teams is solely dedicated to the houseless population. So when you see a large amount of interactions between police and houseless, in the houseless population, one of the things that they did is that they're now sending out the BHRT teams to see if they can to provide services or to coordinate with services, not provide services, but to have services coordination. And so one of the things that we've measured is BHRT effective? And one of the things that we've seen is that, yes, prior to BHRT intervention, you had a significantly higher number of police interactions than after BHRT intervention. So the fact that PPB can now identify those trends and dispatch a team dedicated solely to the houseless population in an attempt to reduce those interactions, that again brings us back to have they implemented systems to resolve issues on their own, and there's one of the examples of them being able to do that. And so I just wanted to bring that conversation back into the systems aspect of it.
Okay, thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Elliot. Thank you both for responding. Britt?
You and Elliot actually covered most of what I wanted to talk about. This might be a stupid question. I wasn't here for the presentation, but in terms of the training, I was reading about the scenario training that's been implemented recently. And in terms of the debrief, so I was interested to read that a lot of officers were struggling with the training at first. In terms of the debrief, is it mostly just the instructors talking to or sharing their own takeaways with officers, or is there actually a way to have officers reflect themselves and actively rework through some of these things so that they are able to make improvements and not just move on after hearing a lecture that they don't really listen to? If that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, that's good. First of all, it isn't a lecture. They're actually engaging with a person in an encounter, an actor, and they don't know what this actor is going to do.
Yeah, I meant for the debrief afterwards.
Yeah,
after
so
the
then there's a debrief, but you're absolutely raising some good points. So the debrief was pretty sophisticated. It did ask them to talk about what they did and why they did it, and to think through their actions. And then they more and more engaged them. And then they asked them how that tied into procedural justice and some of the concepts. And then they gave them actual feedback on their performance. They got it rated and evaluated on a 3-point scale. And so there was a system created to give feedback to each officer immediately after the encounter. And you could fail if you really did horrible. I don't know that anybody did, but they did vary. There was variation in their scores, and it correlated highly with my own observations. So I thought they did a pretty good job.
Thank you.
Great question, Britt. Patrick?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Homelessness is not mentioned in this at all. But what is mentioned is mental illness. And I would like to can you guess which two groups of people are least likely to report when you ask them to report? People of color and people with mental illnesses, right?
Yeah.
Which are the
To report what?
that they've had a negative incident with the police.
Oh, out of fear.
Yeah. And then secondly, I am somebody who lives in East County, and I feel it's really important to pay attention to such things. Well, I live in East Portland, I should say, not East County. I am somebody who is on the pccep. I probably would expect an invite of some sort, and I can honestly say that I'm not aware of when the annual report was to my precinct. So maybe they're just not effective at getting it out, or maybe there was causality somewhere there. I do want to say thank you for recognizing that you're passing the baton, and that you are recognize that substantial compliance is not a means to, is not the be all end all of a record, and it does recognize that there is room for improvement. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate those comments. I'll just say that I totally agree with you that they might be less likely to report on a survey. Hopefully they would, because the surveys are anonymous and people are told that. We may not trust that, but and I also hope the complaint system, I can't remember here, I think it's moderately good with IPR, but you also don't want people to be afraid to
I agree totally, but
Yeah.
for instance, there are times in my life when I would not feel comfortable reporting an incident that the police had with me.
And that has to do with
Can you
trust.
speak in the microphone, please? Dr. Rosenbaum.
Oh, sorry. That has to do with trust, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to swing it back down to the center of the table. I just want to let everybody know we're going to take a break after all the PCEP members give a comment, just because there's been such a long section here, and then we'll come back to public comment. We have Sam down there, and we'll go back this way.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is I don't have a problem with finding substantial compliance. When looking at the document and what it says and what's required, I think all the things that are coming up are important issues, and I don't minimize any of them, but I think those are issues for us to take up as for PCEP to take up moving forward. The substantial compliance is not, again, it's been said, not the be-all to end-all. And I think when Mayor Wheeler created the PCEP, his thought and his hope is that it would outlast the DOJ and the settlement agreement, that we would still be working together with the community and the police to make sure that these issues are addressed, and that the police continue to do the work that the Department of Justice settlement agreement says and the community expects. I see this as we're not at the finish line, but like we're coming out of the blocks. It's the start. It's the beginning of change, and I do think over the last 5 years there's been a lot of improvement from the Portland Police and the community engagement, and we're in a different place than we were. That doesn't mean we're where we want to be by any means. When people are still being shot and killed and profiling, we still have a lot of issues to deal with, but I don't have a problem with substantial compliance.
Thank you for that perspective, Sam. Steve?
So my question is, you actually studied other cities who've gone through similar types of reviews from the Justice Department and so forth. And it's interesting to me that there's a lot of, every incident of the police showing up and dealing with these things starts with somebody called, or, usually somebody called. So that goes to BOAC. And it's interesting that the review of BOAC procedures are done just by the behavioral health unit and the behavioral health unit assistant chief. And I'm not familiar if that department, who carries a heavy weight, has any kind of other advisory committees that oversee the procedures and the metrics that that are needed to ensure that the police officers have all the right information, that these procedures continue to follow. I just don't know how in the future they will be held accountable. That's the question I have.
Yeah, well, there is a BHU advisory council, a committee, and that oversees, and that has a number of entities on it, not just police related. And that's an oversight committee. I don't know if you're aware of that or.
Yeah, I'm aware of that. My thing is BOAC. It's the actual communication folks.
Gotcha.
Like, I know there's a ton of advisory committees for the Portland Police.
Yes.
Are there any over them to ensure that they're doing best practices?
Not to my knowledge. Does you want to answer that, Chief? Yeah.
Good evening. I'm Bob Causey, Director of BOEC. And when you ask about the accountability, I think you're looking at in terms of making sure that our dispatchers and call takers are following the procedures. We have a user board that oversees our operations. They help us establish policy. We also have not as robust as I'd like it to be, but we're in the process of developing our quality assurance program. And that is starting with medical and fire call taking triage. We're just now implementing a new program. In fact, our kickoff is next Monday to integrate medical and fire triage within our call taking and integrate it in the computer system. Police calls for service are a little bit different. We're not going to be integrating that right away. But our hope is that within a year, we're going to have an established quality assurance program specifically tied to medical calls and fire calls. After that, it's probably another year beyond that time frame to be able to implement the police call-taking protocol that's integrated within the system. With those protocols integrated, we're able to do set quality assurance that is prescribed. I don't remember the percentage off the top of my head. Prescribed number of calls that we review. But in the meantime, we are reviewing calls that are assigned to BHU and those types of mental health triage calls.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could you state your name one more time for us?
Yeah, Bob.
Okay, we're gonna finish off with Lakeisha.
I think a lot has been said. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. We are going to take a 5-minute break. We'll be starting back at 7:25. And we'll get going on that. Thank you. Give Sam a chance to get back. Okay, so how we're going to conduct the second half of this public comment section is we are going to just hear from community members. We're not going to have Dr. Rosenbaum respond just in the interest of time. What we will do is allow Dr. Rosenbaum to type up any notes or any kind of responses that we'll provide publicly. We're going to have a 15-minute period for this, and we will end it at 7:45. We have 2 microphones. If you just want to line up and then state your name and the organization you're with, and then give your comments. Keep your comments related to this. If your comment is not about the settlement agreement, we're just going to cut it off, or the COCO report, excuse me. Yeah, so we're going to open it up right here.
Hi, I'm Mike Schumann. I'm with Portland Cop Watch.
Hang on one second. Where's Dr. He's got to be here for any comments, so.
Okay.
Give us a second. We're Dr. Rosenbaum. There he is.
Killing it home.
Just give us half a second for him to get settled. All right. So just so you know, just to reiterate, we're having 15-minute comment process. We're gonna ask that Dr. Rosenbaum that you not respond just in the interest of time so we can get as many community members through. And then any notes or feedback you want to give, you can type those up and then we can put them up on the pccep website for folks to respond to that. And we'll make sure to record names too, just for that purpose. So if you could say your name and your
My name's Mike Schumann. I'm with Portland Cop Watch, and I just want to give a little perspective to this whole thing. 6, 7, 8, 5 years ago, and continuing, the city had a problem with the Portland Police Department. They were using excessive force, a lot of it on mentally ill people, and it was so bad that the federal government came in and they sued the city to try and get it straightened out. And the city, in its wisdom, hired the esteemed Dr. Rosenbaum to come in and see if we can correct the problem. And this is a quote for today: "Outcomes are not the main focus of the settlement agreement." What are you doing here if outcomes are not the main focus of the settlement agreement? Outcomes are what we wanted you to do, to change things so that it doesn't keep happening. And my second and other comment is, in the last 2 years, I don't think any police officers in the last several years were disciplined for excessive force. And so there's a whole component of this thing which says that if a police officer is continually or start using force that they shouldn't be using, that somebody disciplines them. The main problem in Portland is it doesn't happen. It's like the elephant in the room. And those are the only two things I have to say.
Thank you.
Thank you for those comments.
Hi, I'm Dan Handelman. I'm also with Portland Cop Watch, and I could spend 15 minutes talking about this, but I'll do as quickly as I can, the comments that I do have. I appreciated that the question was raised about why we still have people with mental illness dying at the hands of the police. And this is not just a statistical aberration. If you look with a larger pool of data, if you go back in time, if you look at what the OIR group published, when they were looking at stuff before the DOJ came, 55% of the people who were killed had mental health issues. Afterwards, 65% of people did. So in the last 2 years, I would say there were 3 people this year who had mental health crisis. In the last 2 years, that number is 54%. So we're back to where we were before, but it's not improving. So just looking at this as 1 or 2 incidents a year isn't doing a statistical scientific analysis, which is what we're expecting from the compliance officer. On that note, I believe that Dr. Rosenbaum said that there was no force used other than minor kinds of force against people with mental health issues, but we had at least 2 or 3 people who died this year had mental health issues. So those statistics exclude deadly force. So we are going to put out a longer statement. We already talked a little bit to folks, including the media, about concerns about the findings. I'm very glad that PCCep is thinking about asking them findings not to be complete. The IPR reaching a 94% goal, or when the goal is 100% of investigations in 180 days, that's clearly not in compliance. And there was no analysis of the fact that the reason that both Internal Affairs and IPR have been able to speed up their investigations is that they've gotten rid of half their investigations by giving them to supervisors and calling it supervisory investigations. And the COCL hasn't had time, because these only started a few months ago, to do an analysis of whether those are being appropriately categorized and whether it's more serious cases that used to be investigated are now being shuffled off to these supervisors. So of course it's easier to get your job done when your caseload is cut in half. The BHU Advisory Committee, which was mentioned, still doesn't hold open meetings. Yes, the settlement agreement doesn't technically say they have to have open meetings, but what we're talking about in terms of compliance and outcomes is the spirit of this agreement, not the letter of the agreement. And that is what I think we're wrestling with between what you're saying and what we're saying. right? The spirit is those meetings should have been open from day one, and they've never had an open public meeting of the BHUAC. They had one kind of public event, but it wasn't a meeting. And the Mental Health Association asked them in March, one more time, to open meetings, and they waited until after your report came out that said, oh, they don't have to do it, we just suggest that they do it, and finally answered the Mental Health Association and said, we're not going to do it. So you greenlighted a continuation of something that goes against the idea of community engagement. And I don't know if anybody's waiting to talk. The PPB's annual reports were presented with, the first one was presented with no advance notice that we know of. The one in East County, or in East Precinct, was done with 1 day's notice, and the one at City Council happened 8 days after it was announced here at this meeting, which didn't give us time to turn people out. There were only 5 of us, including me, who testified at that meeting. If the Bureau was engaged with the community and interested in community engagement, they would have publicized it, turned people out, and actually asked City Council to hold an evening meeting so people who worked during the day could have made it. So this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg of some of the things I wanted to say. And if there's extra time, I'd like to...
Yeah, maybe we'll have you come back up. I want to make sure that we open it up to other folks. Thank you, Dan.
Hi, I'm Jan Friedman. I'm here with Disability Rights Oregon. And I just want to make the point that I think that this has been a long process, of course. So many people have been in on this long process. I think at this point, trying to wrap it up too fast and trying to say, oh, it's done because there's that output. Look, they've done this and they've done that, but we don't care about outcomes. Or outcomes aren't really the point. Let's look at the paper. But, the pccep has a difficult job. They're doing community engagement. The community's not looking at specific paragraphs of the settlement agreement. As you know, this was a issue of unconstitutional use of force back in 2012, settlement agreement in 2014. pccep has only had 1 year to convene and work on community engagement. I think they're doing a great job doing their work, but this is not enough time to engender trust. We don't have trust. We don't have full engagement, not for lack of trying, but because it's only been really in the last year and quite recently that we have a community engagement plan even. So let's put it in place, let's see how it works, and let's afterwards have that extra year. Because if we're just, waltzing off now, it's just not right. It seems like a rush to the finish line, and it's not the kind of thing we can rush on. That's not fair to our citizens.
Thank you, Jan.
Alexa Simpson. I'm actually an unhoused community member. There's a couple things that I wanted to touch on. If these community surveys are being required to be sent out or initiated based off of a phone call or a text, that data is going to be skewed and erroneous. Because if over 50% of the encounters are with the unhoused community, those should be sent out via mail. Any other official public notice has to be published in the newspaper. For those that have a lack of telephony-based services or the choice to lack telephony-based services. So that data is not going to be representing what's truly happening, and these encounters are not going to be documented, and these surveys aren't representing what's really happening out there. Additionally, a major concern that I have is the lack of a cycle or rotation in regards to the officer patrol districts or regions that they patrol to prevent the development of personal relationships with the unhoused community. I've personally witnessed and been a victim of discriminatory, biased, and predatory behavior. And this is especially true during the conducted sweeps. And I was informed by an active patrol officer on duty during a sweep that the officers conducting or helping facilitate the sweeps are not shown as active or available officers on duty. And that data is not even shown to their colleagues or other officers in the field. So that leads me to believe they're operating without proper surveillance. That's a huge oversight. This is something that remains unmentioned in any documentation that I see in regards to the police conduct in our city. And some of the things that I have personally gone through and witnessed are foul. Especially very, very predatory behavior, especially with warrant sweeps. People are exposed, they're having to move their belongings. A lot of the information that's presented to the public in regards to the process when it comes to these sweeps is incorrect. If you call this one point of contact system line, it indicates we have advocates at street level who provide us with services or information on how to access said services, which are either lacking or non-existent. They state that they give us a specific time frame and date for these sweeps to be conducted. That's not true. We're given about 7 to 10 days, 2 days in some areas. There's no transparency in regards to what's considered of value or of necessity. And we're having private patrol companies determine what's of value or necessity and take our belongings then to these storage facilities that are difficult to contact or require that there's police interaction to obtain your belongings. And I feel that's actually intentional because a lot of the in-house community has had a poor interaction with an officer. They feel scared, or put in a position where they're re-traumatized, and then their belongings are not retrieved, and they're put back in a position again where they're displaced further. The divide is just growing when it comes to having respect or a desire to work with the city or the city officials, and people feel hurt, damaged, traumatized, and lost. And if you want to see growth and you want to see people being active in their community, there needs to be respect. And I feel that there's none. That's all that I have to say at this point in time. Thank you.
Could you say your name one more time, please?
Yes, Alexis Simpson.
Thank you for sharing your lived experience. I'm going to go to Philip.
Hi, this is Philip Wolf speaking. I'm a community member here, living in 10 years here in the city of Portland. Several things I'd like to discuss tonight one is a question about an evaluation that's occurring when the police officer has considered a community member a concern or a mental illness status. So I don't feel comfortable with police making that decision. I feel like a mental health professional should be making that decision to take somebody to maybe a drop-off center, because when a police officer in uniform with police vehicles taking people off the street anywhere will create more of a crisis. Also, in this area, many of the houseless people have been taken in, and if you recall, our Mayor Ted Wheeler for the City of Portland had established an anti-homeless laws, which actually it actually means that private business owners, private homeowners can just see people on the street and call the police for no reason, no broken law other than the fact that they're houseless. So that is a systemic problem that needs to be addressed. The tents and the street sweeping has been allowed to escalate more crisis situations. There must be a resolution to this problem. The laws that are being set now are reinforcing the problem, and so this is a situation that's just going to be increasing in severity. With all due respect, I do understand how the settlement agreement is worded and what exactly needs to be changed with it. It does need to be complied with. Now, I just encourage the pccep members to do more than what is defined in the settlement agreement. You have this opportunity to take advantage of your position, because I feel like the pccep members are really naive to think that police reform is the solution. That's not the outcome. Police reform is not only the problem, it's a systemic issue. It could be that from the youth, detention centers, they're a pipeline to prisons. The gang enforcement task force, they are gangs members themselves. They're part of their own kind of gang. They have the authority now to profile people of color and other areas. There's for-profit prisons. The unions are protecting the police. If there is a lethal force, the police are able to get immediate representation, and they are supported in every facet of their employment. And now, we've had this discussion for 40 years, and there has been no change. And we won't see any changes unless the system has been dismantled or rebuilt.
We're going to cut it right there.
It's a consideration that we consider the violence. You know, we're not talking about police behavior and police violence. There are violent police officers that we can discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. These are our last two folks that will present.
Hello, so my name is David Danos, and I'm a rogue Canadian who found his way here by accident at the hands of Philip. So I wanted to commend Dennis over here for presenting the data in a way that's very favorable to the Portland Police Bureau. I want to direct everybody's attention to this kind of biased framing of the data, specifically of the percentage of lower rates of force, and the comparing specifically to US localities. The percentage of lower rates of force, his quote is patterns and not outcomes, and that's a very academic way of looking at things, and that's also a very problematic way of looking at things. I'm also an academic. I've been studying years at the University of British Columbia on the implementation and the historical and contemporary laws around colonization and ongoing genocide, specifically in Canada, but also in the US. And academia plays a huge role in the furthering and the implementation of genocide, specifically in the acceptance by using and manipulating statistics and policy, statistics and numbers to present itself in a favorable way to the institutions that execute those genocidal policies. So effectively what's happening is, everything that I've seen here from a glance is it's really great at putting administrative tasks with no real structural reform. And the two really big areas of genocide is bureaucracy and academia. Academia for the acceptance, and the bureaucracy for ensuring that there's difficulties for the people who are struggling with the system to be able to get through it. And so we're seeing no structural reform. Things like adding trainings is not a structural reform. It is the using of favorable looking policies in a way that enhances the structures to continue exacting its devastating violence on communities. And so we're ignoring that structural violence through the use, like what's being discussed is ignoring totally the use of violence through the use of power. And power is not force. Power is everything from clothing to training, to tools and weapons, to the language that's used, to where police officers stand, they walk, how they engage with community members. All of that is power, and we haven't even touched on that. And so the role of policing within community engagement, there's the issue there. Structural reform would not look at trainings within that. It would look at changing what the action of policing looks like. Within communities themselves, police officers are not meant to be police officers. They're meant to be members of a community that help maintain and support and protect that community. So separating that is a way that academics further and promote the use of genocide and violence against communities. And I'm using the term genocide very clearly here because the US refuses to use that term, and it's ridiculous. There are thousands, and I'm not mincing words, thousands of active genocides going on right now. So my and comparing to US cities specifically, we can't just look at US cities. US is pardon my words here, a shit stain on the world in terms of police violence. The US is not something to compare it to. Looking at US cities and saying Portland is the best model, it's saying it's the best model of number something like 200 in the world in terms of police violence. It's ridiculous. Why are we not looking at other countries around the world? Why are we not looking specifically at communities that do not use policing models and engaging with them and understanding how communities work without the use of policing models, because they exist all over the world, in every country in the world, in communities everywhere. So my recommendation to you, Dennis specifically, is to please evaluate your data so that they are presented and they think outside of the Americentric bubble. You think outside of that American bubble that makes it look like violence is what we need and makes it look like policing is a standard use of community engagement. And for everyone, I would urge everyone to be keen, please be keen on seeing where that structural bias is in the data that is presented, because the data that has been used here was manipulated and was used to advance specifically the the narrative of ensuring the continued support and the continued foundational existence of police here, which is ridiculous. So please, please, please reevaluate your data. Oh, and it's David Danos from Canada.
Thank you, David from Canada. Last but not least.
Hello, Vanessa Perone, Alexa's mom. There's a lot of passion and compassion there. Thank you for what you've said. First off, my understanding is supposed to be a peace officer. That is not what I see. I see a lot of, this is just because I am houseless, I am on the streets, and Alexa and I have seen and dealt with a lot. So there are a lot of crooked cops, and there's a lot of gang members that run the streets. There's a lot of mentally ill that roam them. It's sad. These sweeps, bad. It is causing more stealing and more violence than anything. We've been trying to attend a lot of meetings to gain a lot of insight from all of you, and I'm sure there's a lot of compassionate people here, and that's why we're here. We want change, we want better. And it starts with an area. Let's give us space that is safe so that we don't have to have so many mentally ill just roaming around, that they can get help. And then the ones that actually want to get off the streets don't have to worry about their shit getting stolen. Police coming by and harassing. The same police, like my daughter said, that's the problem, is you have the same police officers. They're in the same areas. They are building relationships with a lot of the wrong people and allowing a lot of the wrongdoings. So the surveys, never seen it. I don't know why they're not in community buildings. You know, why aren't they at TPI, CCC, library, you know, all the places that these mentally ill and houseless people are? I've never seen them, never heard about it. We need to have street advocates, peers like us, good people that are out here, actually ones to help engage, because we know these people, you know, so they're more comfortable to come up to us, and maybe we can help them move forward easier. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Do you have room for one more comment?
Very quickly, yep.
Okay. I won't be as long as some folks, but I'll take more than a minute. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to read this because it's a little hard.
Use the microphone, please.
Yep. Oh, sorry. And I'll say my name in just a second. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'd like to thank the pccep for welcoming the community, and thank Dr. Rosenbaum for his presentation and feedback.
Just speak in the microphone, please. Yeah. I mean, a little hard.
My name is Sarah Carlson. I'm a community member of the Portland Police Bureau Training Advisory Council, or TAC, since January, so I'm a new member. I'm grateful for the opportunities I've had to attend trainings and the willingness of the officers to meet with me so I can learn more. And I hope over time to share my insight with them. I'm also a community member who struggled with mental health challenges. I had a mental health crisis in 1986, just before my 15th birthday. I was a runaway. The police did find me after about a week. I spent 60 days in a psychiatric hospital being treated for depression. I've had some challenges as an adult, and I've also been impacted as a family member. And I share this because I imagine I might have an opportunity to connect with some of you. I'm finally in a position where I'm comfortable to start sharing my story in the hope that I might help others, and it's taken me 35 years to be ready to do that. At the time that I was in my crisis, my father was a Navy captain. He was commanding a destroyer, and he was at sea. They actually wanted to send me to long-term, but we were moving, so I got out, and the next day we moved. And although I was in treatment for years, we never spoke of it again. So, you know, so I hope that by sharing my story as an adult, who doesn't have to worry about my job or a security clearance or a lot of other things, I can maybe help. I can help some teenager who's struggling, or you know, we had good insurance. My family, although I didn't believe that they loved me, they fought for me, and not everybody has those advantages. So I just share that because somebody here might need to hear that. But I do have questions about the agreement for Dr. Rosenbaum. Do you, for your write-up, do you have some best practices or insight to share for organizations that have been successful following the end of a settlement? And then also, if you see organizations that haven't been successful, and this might not be the right term, I apologize for that, what are they doing or not doing? Because that might be something that we as community members or members of the training advisory council or this organization can also use for our learnings to inform going forward.
We're not going to have Dr. Rosenbaum respond. Just
No, he's going to write it.
Yeah, perfect.
But I just want to ask my question.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any other questions? I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, but I wanted to share a little bit about me and why I do this, because I think that's important.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
What was your name again?
Sarah Carlson. Thank you.
Really appreciate all the testimony and feedback from the community members. That was really impactful. If I could have our co-chairs of our subcommittees just raise your hands real quick, just so folks, if they want to get involved in some of these subcommittees, I would really encourage you to talk to them after the meeting, and we could really use your input in figuring out how to reach more of those individuals that you talked about. So thank you for that. We are going to move. Yes, sir.
Can I say something real quick?
Yeah.
Alexis Mom, I want to thank you for sharing what you shared. I worked as a park ranger for 6 years, and I was out there, and I saw the sweeps and some of the stuff that took place. I agree with you that I don't know what the practice is now. The sweeps are not humane, they're not a good way to engage and treat people that are living on the streets. Taking your property, I know the system that you talked about, and putting it in a warehouse or a place that you struggle to even get to, let alone get your property, and have people determine what is or what isn't valuable to you, is real to you, and it's your stuff. So I don't want that to be lost on everyone here, whatever, as we move forward. Because not only us, but the city has to do better at addressing how we treat homelessness and how we treat people that are houseless in our community, especially when we're engaging with them, whether it's the police or anybody else, and taking their property. I've witnessed it, and I want to thank you for sharing your story and making it personal so that people here can understand. And if you didn't, it's real. And I don't know if they still have that set up where you have to go to the warehouse or the whatever the heck that thing is. I think I've said from day one, it's not a good system. So I want to acknowledge that I hear you, and I appreciate you sharing that.
Thank you, Sam. We're going to move into our final piece of the meeting, which is our recommendation process. We have 4 recommendations. Elliot's going to present one on a bylaw amendment change on the voting process. I'm going to present one on the recommendation to define outcomes for substantial compliance. And then we have 2 recommendations from the subcommittee on the people with mental illness. I think what we're going to do is this, in the interest of time, is to have each author read their recommendation, discuss any comments from pccep on all 4 of those in a row, and then have public comment at the end on any 4 of those recommendations, just so we don't go through a process of present, comment, vote, and all of that. Does that sound fair? Okay, so I'm going to open it up to Elliot. But I will say this also, unless there's any disagreement from pccep members, that we will stay past 8:30 to make sure these get finished, because a lot of hard work was done. This meeting has been very helpful, so if you do have to leave, you can let me know if we don't get to all the votes yet, what you would be voting on these. And with that, I'll turn it over to Elliot.
Thanks, Lakiana. So this is a very technical and I think hopefully simple change to the bylaws. It's responding to an issue which came up at the August meeting where we had 8 members on the board, 6 voted in favor of something, 2 abstained, and it didn't pass because the bylaws as they exist now said you need 7 members out of 13, and there were only 8 members there, and that caused a lot of concern amongst community members who felt like the wishes of the board, at least the present members, was not being expressed through the vote. And so this amendment asked to change section 4F on voting. It currently says the majority of seats per ORS 174.130 will be how is voted, and I simply want to change that to be the majority of members present at the meeting. The Oregon statute that's cited there simply states that voting in Oregon will be done by a majority, but I consulted Eliza Kaplan at Lewis and Clark Law School, and she assures me that the quorum, the way the legislature in Oregon works is you have established a quorum, which is also in our bylaws. Once you have the quorum, which in our case would be 7 members, then after that is when you could have a majority vote. So it simply would allow us to pass measures without a cumbersome process, because we've had many meetings, unlike this one, where many of our members have not been present.
Thank you. This recommendation is called the recommendation to define outcomes for substantial compliance. It follows the public testimony, which was overwhelming, that they feel substantial compliance is premature, and it's almost impossible to define what success looks like without outcomes. And I'm just going to read it briefly. So it says, whereas the compliance officers conclude that the City of Portland and the Portland Police Bureau have reached substantial compliance in the Department of Justice settlement in case yada 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 as laid out in their quarterly report dated October 3rd, 2019. Whereas steps have been taken by the Portland Police Bureau to address issues raised by the Department of Justice settlement, they've crafted engagement plans, trainings, and policies, among other steps. In doing so, they have included the public and pccep in shaping these plans. Whereas while we, the pccep members, believe these actions are a step in the right direction, we believe an assessment of substantial compliance is premature. There is not enough evidence to determine substantial compliance. The assessment is based on outputs where the focus should be on outcomes. Whereas the Portland Police Bureau continues to make strides in improving relationships with marginalized communities, there remains a large gap in trust with many marginalized communities of Portland, including the African American community and other communities of color, the houseless community, and the mentally ill community, among others. The death of Andre Gladden highlights the deadly consequences of PPB's continued struggle to engage with persons of mental illness and African American community members. Additionally, according to an Oregonian analysis in 2017, over 50% of the arrests by PPB officers were houseless individuals. The PPB's own data shows that half the use of force incidents in the last 2 years were of houseless people. Furthermore, a 2018 city budget office report highlighted the disproportionate arrest of Black students at Portland Public Schools. These are but a few statistics that highlight areas of concern that must be addressed if substantial compliance is to be affirmed. Whereas assessment of paragraph 84 of the settlement agreement highlights scenarios and trainings implemented by PPB, which is the output, more time is needed to assess if this positively impacts behavior of officers' interactions with community members, the desired output. And as Mr. Rosenbaum had stated, it's too early to assess if these things are actually working. Assessment of paragraph 89 acknowledges the work of the Unity Center to provide mental health services, the output. However, PCEP has concerns about the effectiveness of Unity Center to adequately support the needs of those suffering from mental illness, the outcome, and there's a recommendation that we'll talk more about that further. More time is needed to work on the deliverables of these and other paragraphs of the settlement agreement and show true and sustained success. Whereas the aforementioned statistics and questions cast doubt on the assertion of substantial compliance has been met, PPB and the City of Portland should continue their effort to better serve all communities of Portland and further articulate what success looks like. The compliance officer should further evaluate all sections of the settlement agreement and provide an update of the progress of PPB in the city and their fourth quarter report. Resolved that the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing, number 1, disagrees with the assessment of compliance officer assessment of substantial compliance, recommends that the compliance officer further assess the sections of the quarterly report dated October 3rd, 2019, and allow more time for the outputs to demonstrate the desired outcomes. And number 3, recommends that the Portland Police Bureau and the mayor more clearly articulate what their desired outcomes are based on the required outputs detailed in the Department of Justice Settlement Agreement. Therefore, be it resolved that the Portland Community Engaged Policing recommends that Chief Outlaw and Mayor Wheeler work with PCCep and other community partners to define what true substantial compliance looks like to the community of Portland. This can be done by articulating clear outcomes, as was mentioned numerous times tonight, that align with the outputs as established in the settlement agreement that are acceptable to both PPB and the community in order to establish substantial compliance. We further recommend the compliance officer defer assessment of substantial compliance until further progress can be evaluated. Below is a summary of that recommendation in more easier to read terms. Patrick.
We have Meredith Mathis here tonight to speak to us about our two recommendations, and I do want to recognize Mark Shore and Timothy Russell, both members of our subcommittee.
Thanks for being here.
My name is Meredith Mathis. As Patrick said,
We can't hear you.
You can't. Is that better? Okay.
There you go.
All right. So we have two recommendations, both related to item 89, but they're separate but both connected. And so COCO had stated that the Portland Police Bureau and the City of Portland have substantially complied with item 89, which specifically details that a drop-off walk-in center be established. And they had listed the reason for compliance being that the Portland Police Bureau and the City of Portland have effectively partnered with the Unity Center for Behavioral Health. So the first issue is that Unity is not a walk-in center. It's not just that it's not a sufficient walk-in center, it's that it is, by definition, not a walk-in center. It is a hospital-level psychiatric emergency service. It was never intended to be a walk-in center. We have a list of bullet points we provided in the recommendation itself that we want COCO to consider. One of them is the memo that was written by Daryl Walker, the Chief Executive Officer of Cascadia, and Jeffrey Eisen, the Chief Medical Officer at Cascadia, in which they detail from an experienced professional perspective what constitutes a walk-in center. And they specifically distinguish that from a hospital-level psychiatric emergency service that is what Unity is. In addition to that, we ask that COCO consider the safety issues that have arisen at Unity. There have been well-documented instances of patient death, patient on-staff assault. There have been OSHA complaints, OSHA citations, abuse investigations, and we ask that COCO consider this, that if Unity is overwhelmed and had so much dysfunction that because of this, there were many days where Unity had to be on diversion. So if police wanted to send somebody experiencing a mental health crisis to Unity, it would have to be diverted to another hospital. And then in addition to that, we ask that COCO look at the testimony provided from persons who have been patients at Unity Center. And we've noted that police officers can have people experiencing a mental health crisis transported by ambulance to Unity Center, but multiple reports show patients often escalate in this process, leading to more police involvement and an escalation in force, resulting in arrest, incarceration, or forced hospitalization. Overloaded with patients, Unity has frequently diverted patients to be boarded in hospital emergency rooms, forcing behavioral health care providers to find other options. Multiple reports describe Unity alone as an insufficient response for persons in a mental illness crisis in our city. We urge that COCO reevaluate and update its classification of item 89 of the settlement agreement. And Dr. Rosenbaum did note that the settlement agreement doesn't have to do necessarily with outcomes and that we have to look at the actual language of the settlement agreement. But I think it's safe to say that in item 89, the United States expects that there will be a walk-in center and drop-off center established, and so Portland Police and the City of Portland can't exactly comply with that, working with that if it doesn't exist. Okay, and then the second recommendation we have is a way that the City of Portland can comply potentially with item 89. And that would be to support the Multnomah County Resource Center that is being developed. There was a lot of focus from Dr. Rosenbaum about the scope of responsibility and what the Portland Police can do. There wasn't a lot of mention of the City of Portland's responsibility. And even in the description of why item 89 was found in compliance, it had to do with the Portland Police's attendance to transportation subcommittees at Unity. It didn't mention the City of Portland's involvement in establishing a walk-in center. So from our recommendation to support the Resource Center, no negotiations by the city were started with HealthShare Oregon, the current CCO, or with Multnomah County, the sole provider of funding for services for people on Medicaid seeking medical treatment for mental illness or addiction. So to that extent, the scope of what the city can do in relation to the settlement has not been met. So capital development is well underway and documented elsewhere for the developing center. Remaining are operating costs. It's likely most or all of this ongoing cost will need to come from county general funds and not CCO, state, or federal resources. A substantial area of cost is payroll for peer-delivered services, including engagement, peer support, security, quality assurance and training, and management. After attending county planning sessions, we estimate peer services will be about 25% of operating costs for the Resource Center. So the Subcommittee for People with Mental Illness recommends the City of Portland contribute 25% of the operating costs for the Resource Center. And that would meet, the Resource Center would meet the, I just turned it off. Can you still hear me?
Is it on?
Is it on?
No. See the light right here is out.
I think it's back on.
It's back. Woo!
All right.
Okay. Well, I'm just wrapping up anyway, but we're recommending that the City of Portland contribute 25% of the operating costs for the Resource Center. And the Resource Center would meet the definition of a walk-in center as well as afford the City of Portland the opportunity to take responsibility for that item of the settlement and be found in compliance. Okay, I'll wrap it up there. Thanks.
Thank you. Could you say your name one more time, please?
Meredith Mathis.
Thank you, Meredith.
Thank you.
We're going to open this up to 2 rounds of comments, one from pccep. It'll last 10 minutes to 8:20, and then we'll have public comment from 8:20 to 8:30, and do our votes right at 8:30. This will be open to all 4 recommendations that were just presented. Whoever wants to start from pccep.
I'm good.
Do we just want to go down the line? Let's ask Vadim then, if he's on the line, if he wants to.
Vadim, are you still here?
Yes, I'm still there.
Do you have any comments on the 4 recommendations?
I do have comments on the recommendation with respect to substantial compliance. Can I be heard by the microphone right now?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay. So with respect to the substantial compliance recommendation put forth with respect to having the COCO review again whether the city and the police department are within, police bureau are within substantial compliance. I think the terms of what a substantial compliance means is laid out in the settlement agreement, and it specifically says
that substantial compliance is achieved if any violation agreements are minor or occasional and non-systemic. I would like to hear more information at some point in time as to why there's a disagreement as to whether the violations, if any, are systemic versus what the compliance officer found was that they're non-systemic and happen from more of a minor occasion. So because it is a settlement agreement, because the terms are outlined within the settlement agreement, and because it's really up to the Justice Department to agree or disagree with the compliance officer's recommendation, I'm not sure to what extent the recommendations that PCCEP can make for the compliance officer to review whether there has been substantial compliance is in keeping with the settlement agreement or with the fact that the Justice Department has the ultimate last word in whether substantial compliance has been met. I think we should, if we disagree with any finding on the compliance officer, I think it's more incumbent upon us to point out those disagreements and present those either before the court or to the Justice Department in their evaluation, rather than instructing the compliance officer to reevaluate what, based on the compliance officer's discussion today, is basically 5 years worth of evaluations. I'm not sure that will be fruitful down the road, so just please keep that in mind when making your votes, and if anybody has a view on that, I would love to hear that view.
Thank you, Vadim. Britt?
I don't have anything. So I actually do have something in response to Vadim. I think what we've heard tonight from the compliance officer is that they don't have the data. It's too early to tell what the outcomes are. So given that, if it's too early to tell, then I believe that means it's too early to determine that there's been substantial compliance, because as I read the agreement, there would need to be some connection between the outputs, having meetings and training, and what that ends up in, or else the settlement agreement means absolutely nothing. And I do believe it means something. And so if we've heard from the compliance officer that in fact they don't have that data, I think it is incumbent upon us to point that out and suggest that we wait until we have the data to show whether there has been substantial compliance. And I would also note that this recommendation is addressed to Chief Outlaw and Mayor Wheeler in addition to the compliance officer. And it is the role of the PCCEP in our charge to communicate to Chief Outlaw and Mayor Wheeler about precisely about the settlement agreement. So I think this is completely within our realm of responsibilities, and everything I've heard tonight convinces me even more that we should vote yes.
Thank you, Elliot. Amy?
The only thing I have concern about is whether or not number 89 really belongs to us, or whether it belongs to the CCOs. Because it does state that the United States expects that the local CCOs will establish by mid-2013 one or more of the drop-off centers for first responders. And if you'd have been around like I was back in the design of the CCO in this conversation with Unity, it was more or less to give the police officers a place where they could legally take clients without having to have a referral system. So Unity was built so that it could be an instant place for police to take folks in serious crisis to get care without having to go through the standard referral process for getting into these inpatient beds. So I just want everybody to know this recommendation still stands with the CCOs being responsible, which is not a city event. So I just want everybody to be aware of that.
Thank you.
In response, I'd like to note that we're responsible for the entire document, the settlement agreement. We're not responsible for specific items.
The only things I would add to the mental illness subcommittee recommendation when it says 2 members of PCEP, I think we should just put it to, and I know this is really technical, but I think it should just go to who we're trying to give it to. So I would in the future recommend saying it goes to Mayor Wheeler and those folks. And can someone show me the other recommendation? I lost my copy of the sea of papers.
There's 2 different.
Yeah.
We can't make recommendations directly to them, though. We want to make them directly to you guys. That was the discussion we had earlier.
Okay. Okay. The other part I would say, where does that go? Oh, yeah. In the second one, it said, item 89 is arguably the most expensive and complicated thing of the settlement agreement. It has not been discussed by COAB or PCEP. I feel like that kind of just takes away a little bit from PCEP because you guys did discuss it within your subcommittee, and that is part of PCEP. So I just think that would just kind of detract from it a little bit. So I would probably just scratch that line out. Other than that, I think both of them look great.
Okay.
I don't have anything to add.
On the, I just want to see where we stand with the funding for this, item 89, that and with the new CCO 2.0, the Medicaid population goes to the CCOs and not to Montgomery County. So I think it needs to be a little bit more research, and I wanted the city attorney to kind of comment on the responsible party for this, and if we can, ask for money and provide resources.
So the paragraph, I think, as has been identified, oh, sorry. The paragraph, as has been previously identified, really talks about what the CCOs will do. At the time, there was a real effort, and the city was agreeing in the settlement agreement to support that effort, but it does clearly delineate the settlement agreement terms, do say, as has been identified by Ms. Anderson, that is the responsibility of the CCOs. And I'm just going to say this really briefly. The settlement agreement is a negotiated agreement, a contract between the city and the United States that was agreed to as to what those obligations were. It's like any other contract. So it needs, the city's obligations need to be measured, and it's the whole city, not just the Portland Police Bureau. The whole city is a party to it. And so what I would argue and will argue is that the specific obligations that are set forth in the agreement are what need to be met for substantial compliance. And just to follow up on what Dr. Rosenbaum said, that does not mean that there is not a lot of additional work to be done. That does not mean that the PCEP should not identify and carry forward many things outside of the settlement agreement. But I think the question for you all as you look at this is, are you looking at the specific terms of the settlement agreement? And nothing in the settlement agreement, I would say, and I freely acknowledge I am the city's lawyer, right? So take that for what it is. I mean, that is my client. But nothing in the settlement agreement obligates the city to fund community mental health services. That is not generally the function of a city. That's a function of community care organizations, the county, the state, and so the city did commit to work toward establishing those goals, but the city did not agree to assume those goals.
Excuse me, before you leave, you mentioned that you agreed, that the city agreed to support it, item 89, and you also called it a contract. Am I mistaken?
Correct.
Thank you.
Good cross-examination.
Are you finished, Lakeisha?
Yeah, I just wanted to see where we stood to not make unreasonable.
Perfect, thank you. Andrew?
Just one comment from me, and it's and I appreciate the subcommittee bringing these and explaining them to us. So thank you. I want to explain one of my no votes, which will be on the recommendation for the 25% support. I previously voted no on another recommendation on another topic, suggesting that Portland spend a certain amount of money in the millions of dollars on a project. And the reason is that I think there are an extraordinary number of public needs in this city, in this county, in this state, in the country. They exceed our revenues, and as a result, we have to make very difficult choices as a community together about what we prioritize. And I am not prepared from where I sit to say that the city of Portland and the taxpayers, that include everyone in this room, should support this at 25% or 45% or 0%. But rather believe in the broader goal of more adequately funding and supporting mental health services. So I wanted to explain why I'm voting no on that one. Thanks.
Thank you. And just so you know, we are into the 10 minutes of the community, but we're going to keep going just so we can get through everybody's comments. Yolanda?
I don't have a question at this time. I just wanted to say thanks for shortening the PCCep recommendation proposal process for community members. It's a lot easier to read and understand now.
Thank you for that comment.
Work with the community engagement plan. I don't feel really like I think not sure that we really did that connected together with the police like it should have. And so I would disagree with that because we have experience with that versus the others. We don't know about the other components, but with that, I think that we're given something and it kind of went through, and now our job is to make sure that all those things actually come about and maybe get added to next time around. So that's the one I'd struggle with.
I just want to mention there that the subcommittee on settlement agreement and policy hosted a forum with the police department about the community engagement plan. We asked questions about it. We brought recommendations to the full board. We passed those, and they were integrated into the plan. Could we have done more? Sure, but I just want to make sure that we remember what exactly we have done in this arena.
Thank you.
Mr. Sachs, final word.
I don't really have anything to add. I echo what the city attorney said and what Mr. Rosenbaum said. And I feel that according to the legality of the document, that substantial compliance has been met. But that, again, doesn't mean that we are where we want to be. There's still a lot of work left to do. And PCCep, Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing, to me, means being engaged with the police and vice versa, the community and the police engaged. That takes a lot of trust and relationship building, and PCCep has to be a part of that and leading that, and we still have a lot of work to do in that area.
Thank you. We're going to open it up to 10 minutes of public comment. Just be mindful of time, but we'll try and get to as many folks as we can. Go ahead. Please state your name.
My name is Tim Ledwith. I'm a housing case manager with transition projects, and for the last few years I worked as a residential advocate at our Willamette Center shelter. I just wanted to comment that earlier it was spoken that working with the houseless was not within the confines of the agreement, but from my perspective, working in the shelter system and working with houseless people, when I first started the job, they would talk about how people with mental health crisis would fall through the cracks into our system, and I learned quickly that no, it's more the opposite. There isn't a sufficient, like as was talked about with Unity, there isn't sufficient alternatives, and occasionally people fall out of the criminal justice system, the shelter system, and the streets into proper mental health care. Very seldomly. Usually they cycle right back. So in terms of when we are dealing with somebody with a mental health crisis at our shelter, which are also not equipped to deal with them, our options are call the police, call 911, or call Project Respond, which is just calling Project Respond, who comes with the police. Or sometimes, like the other day, they just called 911 for me. So, and I benefited recently from a police officer who laid it out for me, like what was going to happen when we have multiple people in severe mental health crisis in the shelter. He said, well, you can let them just tire out, or what will happen is violence. We will have to take this person who doesn't want to come. I'll have to call for backup. They could get hurt. My people can get hurt, and everyone's going to witness it. And I was like, those are the two options. So I think that system is incredibly broken, and I think that I don't see how working with the houseless population doesn't fit within the agreement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dan Handelman again, reporting Cop Watch. Before I forget, we have our newsletter here, which any of you didn't get, please come see me and get it. You have 4 recommendations. First one, vehemently oppose the proposal as it's made. We sent a proposal to the steering committee that the majority should be a majority of seated members, not the people sitting in the room, but the number of people who are actually seated. So you're missing 1 now, so you only have 12. So right now, the number that you need to pass should be 7, I guess, still. But at the time you took that vote, 1 person hadn't gone through training, so there were only 10 seated members at that time. And then that would have passed with 6 votes, as happened. The end result is, otherwise, you can have 4 people on this committee out of 13 making decisions for the whole committee and saying, yes, this is what the PCCEP believes. And I think, especially given the diversity of people on this board, you should consider that is not an appropriate way to do the voting. So the reason that the number is so high, and it's not just under state law and the majority of people are sitting at your table, is to make sure that your voices are all included. The houseless data is the only thing I have to comment on in your second one. I think it's an excellent thing to say this body, which is supposed to independently assess the implementation of the agreement. You shouldn't be letting these people tell you you can't do that. You're doing what you're supposed to do. You're independently assessing it. The only thing that's wrong is that houseless data, the IPR did their own report and they found out that the Bureau only has 1 thing to write in if somebody refuses to give their address. So some people who are listed as houseless may be just people who didn't give an address. So we don't know for sure that it's 50%. I don't think you need to change it for that, but you should be aware of that as you're using that statistic. The third one, we agree with that one. We have a whole section in our analysis about the Unity Center not being adequate walk-in drop-off center. And the fourth one's really out of our wheelhouse, so I'm not going to comment on that. The last thing, we're talking about whether violations are systemic or not. And I talked already about the police shootings. If you look at the police review board reports, and I recommend that you use some hand sanitizer after you do. An example of the kind of thing that's going on is that there was a case where the Citizen Review Committee found misconduct for untruthfulness, which would lead to an automatic firing, and the chief, subsequently to that, even though she said she agreed with her finding, changed the allegation to a performance problem. And so the officer was given, I think it was 1 day off, or either 1 or 3 days off without pay. So this is one instant, but this is a systemic problem if the chief can change what the finding is at the end of this long investigation and the Citizen Review Committee appeal, and then she changes what the finding is. So I want you to look at that. I have some copies of our analysis here. We also tried sending it to you on email. Thank you.
Dan, could I ask you a question? The bylaws I have in front of me under voting say majority of seats. They don't say seated members.
That's what I'm saying. I proposed to you that you change that to the majority of seated members.
Oh, okay.
Right? That's my recommendation, to change that proposal so that it recommends, that it reflects that 4 people can't make a decision for 13 people.
And just for clarification, Elliot, your recommendation would change it to be majority of people who are at the meeting.
Once a quorum is met, yeah, member is present.
Okay, but that wouldn't change necessarily anything here today. Any other public comment?
Alexa Simpson. Discussing financial responsibility being set in care of CCOs versus the city should be carefully examined, as there's no checks and balance system in place to alleviate and prevent further displacement and gentrification. It falls upon the city to be held equally as responsible if demolition and development continues, leading to trauma and unresolved and compounding and ever-growing mental health diagnoses due to the lack of access to those resources. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is it okay if I make further comment? I don't know if it's...
Absolutely.
Okay.
Got about 2 minutes left.
Short, okay. I just wanted to clarify, because people brought up, that the CCOs were supposed to be the main responsible parties, and that's true. That is in the item directly. The reason I was focusing on the actual COCOL evaluation of compliance was because what they were saying made them in compliance was that the PPB was sufficiently partnering with the Unity Center for Behavioral Health. And so the fact that that compliance rested on the partnership is connected to why we're putting it more on the city. Okay, just wanted to clarify that. Thanks.
Thank you. Any further public comment? Okay, any changes based on the feedback we just received to any of these 4 recommendations? All right, we are going to go recommendation by recommendation and vote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The one recommendation you mentioned, I think we should change that.
Which one? Could you state it for us just so we know what you're talking about? Use your microphone.
Yeah, I am. Where was it?
Oh, the part about COIB or pccep being discussed?
You
mean the bylaw one?
Yeah, I
That's
can.
why there's no.
No, the one where we could just remove pccep from that.
Okay, the first sentence.
Yeah.
Where it says, item 89 is arguably the most expensive and complicated portion of the settlement agreement.
Yeah.
Okay. So that first sentence is striked from the...
No, just or pccep. I think. That,
oh, okay. Okay,
yeah.
so just strike pccep from it.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is recommendation on item 89, support for Multnomah County Resource Center. It's the one-pager, and it reads, and yet it has not been discussed by COIB or pccep, and Patrick is striking out or pccep from that, so it would just read, has not been discussed by the COIB, period. COIB. Okay, so we are gonna vote on recommendation number 1. Was there a title for that? Bylaw change? We'll just call it bylaw change. We're gonna go right down the row, starting with Sam. So we want a yes, no, or abstain vote for recommendation on the bylaw change.
Yes.
Steve?
Yes.
Yolanda?
Yes.
Andrew?
No.
No.
Lakeisha? No.
Yes.
Marcia? No. For me. Go ahead.
I think with the bylaws one, it's a little confusing because there was too many things thrown out. But as it was read,
The change would be that it's whoever is present at the meeting. So if we have, barring quorum.
Provided we have the quorum of 7.
Okay.
First, and then
So I just voted no. Amy?
yes.
Elliot?
Yes.
Vadim? Britt?
No.
Patrick?
Yes.
Okay, so that passes with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 votes. Recommendation 2, recommendation to define outcomes for substantial compliance. We're going to start with Steve. Oh, sorry, Sam.
No.
Steve.
No.
Yolanda.
No.
Andrew.
No.
Lakeisha.
abstain.
Marcia.
Abstain.
Lakiana, yes. Amy.
Yes.
Elliot.
Yes.
Vadim. That was a no vote. Britt.
Abstain.
And Patrick.
Yes.
Okay, that was voted down. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 no's. 1, 2, 3, 4 yeses. And 3 abstains. 1, 2, 3. Okay, recommendation 3. This is I need that one again. Recommendation to reevaluation and update of item 89, starting with Sam.
No.
Steve?
Yes.
Yolanda?
Yes.
Andrew?
Yes.
Lakeisha?
Yes.
Marcia?
Yes.
Lakiana, yes. Amy?
Need a little clarification.
Sure, go ahead.
What's the yes and no vote about?
The yes is saying that the COCO should reevaluate and update their substantial compliance of item 89.
Okay, then I vote yes.
Yep. Elliot?
Yes.
Vadim? There's a no vote. Britt?
Yes.
And Patrick?
Yes.
Okay, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. No, this one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 yeses and 2 noes. For that. And then recommendation number 4 is.
So just to be clear, that one passed.
Correct. Sorry. Yes, that
Under
one passed.
any version of the bylaws.
Yep. Support for Multnomah County Resource Center. That's 25% that the city would pay for, starting with Sam.
No.
Steve?
Yes.
Yolanda?
Yes.
Andrew?
No.
Lakeisha?
Abstain.
Marcia?
Yes.
Lakiana, no. Amy?
No.
Elliot?
Yes.
Vadim? Britt?
Yes.
Patrick?
Yes.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm just going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's 6 yeses. It does not pass. It needed 7. So it's 6 yeses. We had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 noes and 1 abstain. So just to recap all of that, recommendation number 1 on the bylaw change passed with 8 yes votes. Recommendation 2 on the outcomes for substantial compliance did not pass. Recommendation 3 on the reevaluation update of 89 did pass. And then recommendation 4, the support for Multnomah County Resource Center did not pass. So 2 bylaws passed, 2 did not. That is going to conclude our meeting. Sorry, I'm getting multiple things.
What's that?
Yep, I know you wanted to say something. Vadim, were you about to say something? Okay, we're going to close it out with some words from Sam.
For those of you who do not know, tonight is my last meeting. I have resigned from the PCEP effective today. I submitted a resignation to Mayor Wheeler. I thanked him for selecting me to be a member of the initial PCEP. And in October is a time of reflection, the Jewish New Year, a time of reflection, renewal, and as I do every year, I reflect on my life, where I was, where I am, where I'm going. And I really appreciate this work, the diversity, the uniqueness of the committee. I feel that it's in a great place, the leadership moving forward, and I'm honored to have been a part of it. My family's been here since the 40s, and my goal and intent in serving on this committee is to give back to my community what it has given to my family since the 1940s. So it really has been a joy and an honor for me to serve. There's no reason for me stepping down other than it's a personal choice. And as I look at my life and my passion, my effort, my energy, and what I want to do and where I want to put that, it's in different places. Not that this isn't meaningful or important, but there are other things in my life that I want to spend that time. Being a volunteer is very time consuming. And so I applaud everyone on here for your commitment, the relationships that we've had, the communication, and I feel that you won't miss a beat losing myself or anybody else. So I just want to say that publicly, and I thank everybody, the police bureau, the mayor, the community, everybody that comes to these meetings. It's a real great process. Judith, Theo, Claudia, Mandy, Nicole, the support that you have given this committee as a city staff is really incredible, and through everything that we encounter. So I want to really thank you, and I think because of you, we are able to support, be supportive and operate the way we do. So thank you, everyone. I'll still be around in town, but tonight is my last meeting, and I wish you all the luck in the world. I did ask the mayor. Thank you. I did ask the mayor to consider replacing me with a person of color, woman, or person with disability. That is my choice, and I've asked him to consider it. Of course, the mayor will make his decision.
Would you like to vote on that recommendation?
I'm sorry? Can we vote on that? Thank you. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, for your service. That concludes our October meeting. Have a good night.